Before the video starts, please leave a like and write any comment. Let's try to reach 1,000 comments and 2,000 likes. The channel has taken a hard hit recently, and I truly need your support. If everyone watching leaves one comment and one like, we can reach that goal together. And now, let's begin. I never should have agreed to that weekend trip. Looking back, the signs were all there. Mason's strange hesitation when describing his family's property. The way his eyes would drift toward the wilderness with something like dread whenever we discussed it. But I was too caught up in my own restlessness to notice, too eager for a break from my monotonous routine in Missoula to question his sudden invitation. "Just a weekend, Alex," Mason had said, leaning against the counter of the coffee shop where we'd met that Wednesday afternoon. "The cabin's rustic, but there's something about being up there that clears your head. No distractions, no noise. Just you and the mountains." I'd known Mason for 3 years by then. We'd met at a local climbing gym, an unlikely friendship between two opposites. Mason was built like a lumberjack, broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a thick beard that made him look like he belonged in the wilderness. He spent more time at his family's remote property than at his apartment in town, hunting his own food and living off the land whenever possible. Me? I was the indoor type. Give me a comfortable chair at a coffee shop and a good book and I was content. Not that I couldn't handle myself outdoors. I'd grown up camping with my family and knew the basics, but I preferred modern comforts to primitive survival. "How remote are we talking?" I'd asked, already mentally cataloging what I would need to pack. "Off-grid," Mason replied, a strange intensity in his eyes. "No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and cooking. My great-grandparents left the land to our family back in the 1920s. Close to 200 acres of untouched forest near the Idaho border." Something flickered in his expression then, a shadow of uncertainty that should have warned me. But Friday morning arrived, and there I was, tossing my overstuffed backpack into the bed of Mason's ancient Ford pickup, ready for what I thought would be a peaceful retreat into nature. The drive took nearly 6 hours, the last stretch on winding mountain roads that seemed to narrow with each passing mile. I watched through the passenger window as civilization gradually disappeared, replaced by dense forests of pine and fir that pressed close to the road. The mountains loomed around us, their peaks vanishing into low-hanging clouds. "Not much farther now," Mason said, breaking a silence that had stretched for almost an hour. I nodded, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. The further we drove from town, the more isolated I felt, as if we were passing through a boundary into somewhere else entirely. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. "Your family's been out here a long time," I said, trying to make conversation. "Anyone else have cabins around here?" Mason shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Used to be a few families scattered around, but most left after the lumber mill shut down in the 60s. Now it's just government land and a few old properties like ours." "Must get lonely," I observed. Mason's response was quick, almost defensive. "I like the solitude." The truck lurched as he turned onto what could barely be called a road, little more than a dirt track overgrown with vegetation that scraped against the undercarriage. Tree branches clawed at the windows and twice Mason had to stop to move fallen logs that blocked our path. "No one's been up here in a while," I commented, eyeing a particularly aggressive branch that whipped across the windshield. "I haven't been back since early winter," Mason admitted. "The snowpack was heavy this year. Roads only been passable for a few weeks." Another warning I should have heeded. Instead, I watched the GPS on Mason's dashboard until even that lost signal, leaving us truly disconnected from the world. After what felt like an eternity of bouncing over ruts and rocks, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood what Mason had generously called a cabin. To my city-dwelling eyes, it looked more like a shack, a single-story structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a sloping roof and a small porch out front. A thin spiral of smoke rose from a stone chimney, dissipating into the afternoon sky. "Smoke?" I asked, confused. "I thought you said no one's been here." Mason frowned, his brow furrowing. "I did. That's strange." He parked the truck and sat for a moment, staring at the cabin. "Stay here, let me check it out." Before I could protest, he was out of the truck, moving toward the cabin with a caution that set my nerves on edge. I watched as he approached the door, pausing to peer through a grimy window before cautiously pushing it open. After a long moment, he emerged and waved me over. "False alarm," he called. "Looks like the Forest Service was through here. They sometimes check the old properties." His voice was light, but something in his posture remained tense, vigilant. I grabbed my pack and approached the cabin, taking in my surroundings. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, ringed by towering pines whose branches swayed in the afternoon breeze. Beyond them stretched countless miles of untamed wilderness. A small creek bubbled past about 30 yards from the cabin, its clear water rushing over smooth stones. The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, a single room with a wood stove dominating one wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far corner. Shelves lined with canned goods, tools, and old books covered another wall. A trapdoor in the floor likely led to some kind of root cellar. "Home sweet home," Mason said with forced cheer, dropping his gear on the table. "I'll get the stove going. Nights get cold up here even in summer." As he busied himself with the fire, I unpacked my sleeping bag and claimed a spot on the floor near the stove. The cabin's single window faced west, offering a view of the setting sun as it slipped behind the mountains. The light was already fading, casting long shadows across the clearing. "We should get some wood chopped before dark," Mason suggested, already heading for the door. "There's plenty of fallen timber we can use." I followed him outside, where he retrieved an axe from a small shed behind the cabin. The tool was well worn but sharp, its handle smooth from years of use. Mason handed me a second, smaller axe and led me to a pile of logs stacked against the shed. "Ever chopped wood before?" he asked, positioning a log on a large stump that served as a cutting block. "Not really," I admitted. "It's all in the follow-through," he explained, demonstrating with a powerful swing that split the log cleanly in 2. "Let gravity do most of the work." I mimicked his stance, raising the axe above my head and bringing it down with as much force as I could muster. The blade bit into the wood but stopped halfway through. With a grunt, I yanked it free and tried again, eventually managing to split the log. We worked side by side as the light dimmed, the rhythmic thud of our axes filling the clearing. I found myself enjoying the physical labor, the simple satisfaction of transforming logs into usable firewood. By the time we had a decent pile, my muscles ached pleasantly, and sweat dampened my shirt despite the cooling air. "That should get us through the night," Mason said, wiping his brow. "Let's head in." As we gathered our tools, a sound froze me in place, a long, low howl echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite wolf, not quite human. A sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mason's face had gone pale, his eyes scanning the tree line with unmistakable fear. "Just the wind through the canyon," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Plays tricks on you out here." The howl came again, closer this time, and Mason grabbed my arm. "Inside. Now." We hurried into the cabin, arms full of firewood. Mason closed and latched the door behind us, then dragged a heavy chair in front of it. The casual wilderness enthusiast I knew had vanished, replaced by someone who moved with urgent purpose, checking the window and securing the shutters. "Mason," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on? What was that sound?" He shook his head, busying himself with building up the fire. "Nothing to worry about. Probably just a wolf." "That wasn't a wolf," I insisted, remembering the unnatural quality of the howl. "And you know it." Mason sighed, shoulders slumping as he sat heavily on one of the chairs. "You're right," he admitted. "It wasn't a wolf, at least not entirely." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my unease growing. "It's just..." He hesitated. "There are stories about these mountains, old stories my grandfather used to tell, about things that live in the deep woods, things that hunt at night." "Things?" I repeated incredulously. "What kinds of things?" But Mason just shook his head again, rising to stir a pot of stew he'd placed on the stove. "Just stories. Probably nothing. Let's eat, and I'll tell you about them after dinner." We ate in silence, the stew surprisingly good despite its simple ingredients. Outside, darkness had fully claimed the forest, and the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. I tried to convince myself that the howl had been just what Mason initially claimed, a trick of the wind, but a deep sense of wrongness had settled over me, a feeling that we were being watched. After dinner, Mason retrieved a bottle of whiskey from his pack and poured us each a generous measure. "Liquid courage," he said with a weak smile, raising his cup in a toast. I took a sip, the alcohol burning pleasantly down my throat. "So, these stories," I prompted. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Mason stared into the flames of the wood stove, his face half in shadow. "My grandfather called them skin teeths," he said softly. "Not wolves, not men, but something in between, something ancient and hungry, like werewolves?" I scoffed, trying to mask my growing fear with skepticism. "No," Mason replied, his expression deadly serious. "Not like the movies. These are different. Older. They don't transform with the moon or any of that nonsense. They're always what they are, and what they are is..." He trailed off, taking another drink. Is what? I pressed. Apex predators, he finished. The best hunters these mountains have ever seen. Another howl split the night. This one so close it seemed to come from just beyond the cabin walls. We both jumped, and Mason moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. See anything? I asked, my heart pounding. No, he whispered. But that doesn't mean it's not out there. I drained my whiskey in one gulp, wincing at the burn. Why did you bring me here if you knew these things were real? Mason turned to me, guilt written across his features. I didn't. Not really. I thought they were just stories, legends to scare children away from wandering too far from home. I haven't heard one in years. I thought maybe they'd moved on, or died out, or, hell, I don't know. I thought they weren't real. As if in answer to his doubt, something scraped against the outer wall of the cabin, the unmistakable sound of claws on wood. Mason's eyes widened, and he backed away from the window, nearly tripping over his chair. It's here, he whispered, reaching for the rifle that hung above the fireplace. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. Mason checked the rifle's chamber, loaded it, and positioned himself against the wall next to the window. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set in grim determination. Is that going to stop it? I asked, nodding toward the weapon. Maybe, he replied, if I hit it right. Head or heart, nothing else will even slow it down. The creature circled the cabin twice more, its movements deliberate and eerily patient. Each scratch of its claws sent shivers down my spine. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, a tense, waiting quiet that pressed against my ears. What's it doing? I whispered after several minutes had passed. Mason shook his head. I don't know. Could be its lost interest, but he didn't finish the thought, and he didn't need to. Whatever was out there hadn't given up. It was planning something. We waited in that suffocating silence for what felt like hours, though my watch told me only 30 minutes had passed. The fire in the stove had died down to embers, casting the cabin in dim orange light. Neither of us moved to add more wood, unwilling to make unnecessary noise. Then, from outside, a snap of twigs, the rustle of underbrush. Something was moving in the clearing, approaching the front of the cabin. Mason tensed, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Stay back, he hissed, eyes fixed on the door. I pressed myself against the far wall, as if those few extra feet might make a difference if the thing broke in. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and my heart thundered so loudly I was certain the creature could hear it. A heavy thud against the door made us both jump. Not a scratch this time, a deliberate impact, as if testing the barrier's strength. The door shuddered in its frame but held firm. Another impact, harder this time. The wood creaked ominously. Mason, I whispered urgently. What do we do if it gets in? He swallowed hard, adjusting his grip on the rifle. Fight or die. The third impact sent splinters flying from the doorframe. One more like that, and the latch would give way. Mason aimed at the door, finger on the trigger, ready to fire the moment it opened. But the fourth impact never came. Instead, there was a soft sound, almost a chuckle, if such an inhuman thing could laugh. And then the unmistakable sound of retreating footsteps. We remained frozen, waiting for some trick, some new attack. Minutes passed, and gradually the tension in Mason's shoulders eased, though he didn't lower the rifle. Is it gone? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it's just waiting for us to let our guard down. We maintained our vigil through the night, taking turns to watch while the other dozed fitfully. I dreamed of glowing eyes and elongated claws, of being chased through endless forest by something that wore both human and animal aspects in horrifying combination. Dawn broke with painful slowness, thin gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. No further sounds had come from outside since the creature's apparent departure. Mason finally lowered the rifle, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. We need to leave, he said, voice rough from hours of silence. As soon as possible, I nodded, already gathering my meager belongings. Will it be safe in daylight? Safer, Mason corrected. Not safe. The stories say they prefer to hunt at night, but that doesn't mean they won't attack during the day if given reason. We worked quickly, packing our gear and preparing to leave. Mason insisted we eat something first. Cold beans from a can and stale bread, arguing that we needed the energy. I forced the food down despite my churning stomach, knowing he was right. When we were ready, Mason cautiously opened the shutters and peered outside. The clearing was empty, bathed in the pale light of early morning. Birds sang in the trees and a gentle breeze stirred the grass. A scene so peaceful it was hard to believe the terror of the previous night. "Looks clear," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'll go first. Check the perimeter. You watch from the window, and if I signal all clear, bring our gear to the truck." I nodded, taking his place at the window as he cautiously unbarricaded the door. Rifle in hand, Mason stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. He descended the steps and moved slowly around the cabin, disappearing from my view for heart-stopping moments before reappearing on the other side. Finally, he returned to the front and gave me a thumbs up. I gathered our packs and joined him outside, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched despite the apparent emptiness of the clearing. "Let's move," Mason said, taking his pack from me and heading toward the truck. We had barely taken 10 steps when a low growl froze us in place. It came from the edge of the trees to our right, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. Slowly, Mason raised his rifle, and I turned to face the source of the growl. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows beneath the dense canopy of pines. Then movement caught my eye, a ripple of darkness separating itself from the gloom. What emerged made my blood run cold. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in coarse gray-brown fur. Its limbs were disproportionately long, ending in hand-like paws with curved claws that could tear through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. But it was the face that struck true horror into my heart, a grotesque amalgamation of wolf and human features, with an elongated muzzle filled with jagged teeth and eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. "Don't move," Mason whispered, his rifle trained on the beast. "Don't run. Whatever you do, don't run." The creature regarded us with those unsettling eyes, its head tilted in an almost curious manner. It sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, then took a step forward, its movement unnaturally fluid for something so large. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. "Easy," he murmured. Whether to me or the creature, I couldn't tell. Another step. The beast was now fully in the clearing, sunlight illuminating its horrific form in merciless detail. Its fur was matted with what looked like dried blood, and scars crisscrossed its massive chest, evidence of past encounters with hunters or rival predators. "Mason," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Before he could answer, the creature suddenly lunged, not at us, but at a fallen log a few yards away. Its enormous claws tore into the rotting wood, sending splinters flying in all directions as it ripped the log to pieces. The display of raw power was unmistakable, a warning of what awaited us if we provoked it. The creature finished its demonstration and turned its attention back to us, letting out another rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through my chest. "It's playing with us," Mason hissed, "showing us what it can do." As if confirming his assessment, the beast rose to its full height, towering over us like some nightmare made flesh. It opened its jaws and released a howl that shattered the morning's stillness, a sound of primeval hunger that stripped away any illusion of safety. "Run!" Mason suddenly shouted, shoving me toward the cabin. "Now!" He fired the rifle, the shot deafeningly loud in the clearing. The creature jerked as the bullet struck its shoulder, but rather than falling, it roared in rage and charged. We sprinted for the cabin, adrenaline propelling us forward. I could hear the beast behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Mason fired again over his shoulder, not bothering to aim properly. The shot went wide, but it bought us precious seconds. I reached the cabin first, yanking open the door and diving inside. Mason was right behind me, slamming the door shut just as the creature crashed against it with bone-jarring force. The impact sent Mason sprawling, the rifle clattering across the floor. "The chair!" he yelled, scrambling to his feet. "Block the door!" I grabbed the heavy wooden chair and wedged it under the doorknob as the creature slammed into the door again, the wood splintering around the hinges. Mason retrieved the rifle and fired through the door, the bullet punching through the weathered planks. A howl of pain told us he'd hit his mark, but it only seemed to enrage the beast further. Claws tore at the door, ripping away chunks of wood. Through the growing gaps, I caught glimpses of matted fur and glinting teeth. "The window!" Mason shouted, already moving toward it. "It's our only chance." He used the butt of the rifle to smash the glass, clearing the jagged shards from the frame. "You first." I hesitated, looking back at the disintegrating door. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," he promised, raising the rifle to fire another shot at the increasingly exposed creature. I clambered onto the bed and squeezed through the narrow window, dropping to the ground outside with a painful jolt. Mason's rifle cracked once more, followed by a click that told me he was out of ammunition. "Mason!" I called desperately. His face appeared at the window, streaked with sweat and grime. "Run for the trees!" he shouted, already forcing his broader shoulders through the opening. Head downhill toward the road. Behind him I saw the door finally give way, the creature's massive form filling the doorway. Mason pushed himself the rest of the way through the window just as claws swiped at where he had been moments before. He landed heavily beside me, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the forest on the opposite side of the clearing from where the creature had first emerged. "Don't look back," he ordered. But I couldn't help myself. The beast was already charging around the cabin, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Its eyes locked on us, and I saw in them a hunger that transcended mere predatory instinct, a malevolent intelligence that understood the game it was playing. We plunged into the trees, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly downhill. The forest floor was treacherous, covered in loose rocks and fallen branches that threatened to send us tumbling with each step. Behind us, the creature crashed through the undergrowth, gaining ground with every stride. "Split up," Mason gasped. "It can't follow both of us." "No," I protested, but he was already veering to the right. "Meet at the road," he called over his shoulder. "Keep going downhill." I hesitated for a crucial second before continuing straight ahead, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. Behind me, I heard the creature's pursuit change direction, following Mason rather than me. A wave of guilt washed over me, but I kept running, driven by primal fear and Mason's urgent command. The slope grew steeper, and I half ran, half slid down the hillside, grabbing at saplings to control my descent. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the pounding of my heart and the rasp of my breathing. Still, I didn't slow, propelled by terror and the certainty that the creature could reappear at any moment. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless, measured only in gasping breaths and burning muscles. Eventually the trees began to thin, and I glimpsed what looked like a dirt road through the foliage ahead. With renewed energy, I sprinted the final distance, breaking from the forest onto the narrow track that we had driven up yesterday. I collapsed to my knees, chest heaving, searching the woods behind me for any sign of pursuit. Nothing moved in the shadows beneath the trees, no sound except the normal chorus of forest birds and the wind in the branches. "Mason?" I called, my voice echoing feebly in the vast wilderness. "Mason," only silence answered. I pushed myself to my feet, looking up and down the road. According to Mason, this track eventually connected with the main Forest Service road about 5 miles downhill. From there, it was another 10 miles to the highway. 15 miles of walking, if I was lucky. I started walking, constantly glancing over my shoulder, straining to hear any sound that might warn of the creature's approach. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher, bringing with it the heat of the day. My mouth grew dry, my muscles protesting every step. I had covered perhaps 2 miles when I heard it, the crunching of gravel behind me. I whirled around, expecting to see 8 feet of murderous fur and claws. Instead, I saw Mason, limping down the road, his face streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead. "Mason," I cried, running back to him. "You're alive." He managed a weak smile. "Barely. That thing nearly had me." He lifted his torn shirt to reveal deep claw marks across his ribs. The wounds weren't bleeding much, but they looked painful. "Lost it by crossing the creek downstream. Water might have confused my scent." "We need to get you to a doctor," I said, supporting him as we continued down the road. "First, we need to get off this mountain," he replied grimly. "That thing will be looking for us." We walked in silence for a time, both too exhausted for conversation. The dirt track eventually widened and showed signs of more regular use. Tire tracks, cleared drainage ditches. We were approaching the main Forest Service road. "Almost there," Mason encouraged, though his face was pale from blood loss and exertion. As we rounded a bend, a welcome sight greeted us. A Forest Service truck parked at the intersection of our track and the wider gravel road. A ranger was checking something on a map spread across the hood. "Hey!" I shouted, waving frantically. "Help! We need help!" The ranger looked up, startled, then quickly folded the map and hurried toward us. "What happened?" he asked, taking in Mason's injuries and our disheveled appearance. "Animal attack," Mason said before I could speak. "Up at my cabin. Some kind of predator." The ranger's expression grew grave. "Let's get you to town. There's been other reports of aggressive wildlife in this area lately." As he helped us into his truck, I caught Mason's eye. His look was clear. "Don't mention what we really saw. Some stories were better left untold to strangers who wouldn't believe them anyway." The ranger, whose name tag identified him as Weston, drove us to the small medical clinic in the nearest town, a place called Miller's Fork that consisted of little more than a general store, a gas station, a diner, and the aforementioned clinic. During the hour-long drive, Weston radioed ahead to alert the clinic of our arrival and questioned us about the attack. Mason stuck to his story. We'd been surprised by a large predator while gathering firewood, possibly a bear or mountain lion. He'd managed to drive it off with a few shots, but not before it had clawed him. Weston seemed satisfied with the explanation, though he mentioned there had been several similar incidents in recent months. 3 hunters attacked since winter, he informed us, his eyes fixed on the winding road. 2 survived. Said it was a bear, but the tracks we found. He shook his head. Game warden's been out twice, couldn't find anything conclusive. I caught Mason's glance in the rearview mirror, a look that confirmed my suspicions. Whatever had attacked us wasn't a one-off encounter. The creatures, skin teeths, as Mason's grandfather had called them, were active in these mountains, and they were growing bolder. At the clinic, a tired-looking doctor cleaned and stitched Mason's wounds while I sat in a plastic chair in the corner, refusing to leave my friend's side despite the nurse's suggestions that I wait outside. Nasty lacerations, the doctor commented, examining the deep gashes on Mason's ribs. But you're lucky, a few inches higher, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Mason winced as the doctor began stitching. How many others have come in with injuries like this? The doctor's hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. Enough to be concerning, he admitted. I've been in these mountains for 20 years. Never seen anything like the wounds I've treated these past few months. Any fatalities? I asked, my mouth dry. 2 confirmed, the doctor replied grimly. A hiker in February, found torn apart about 12 miles from where you boys were. And a local man last month, just outside his home near Red Peak. He shook his head. Sheriff's department says mountain lion, but mountain lions don't typically, well, do the kind of damage I saw on those bodies. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the snip of surgical scissors as the doctor finished closing Mason's wounds. You boys have somewhere to stay in town? He asked, applying a clean bandage. Mason shook his head. My truck's still up at the cabin, all our gear too. I wouldn't recommend heading back up there, not with these wounds and not with whatever's out there still roaming, the doctor advised. There's a motel on the edge of town, nothing fancy but it's clean. I suggest you stay there tonight at least. We took his advice, using the last of my cash to pay for a room at the Pinewood Motel, a single-story building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. The room was basic but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a small bathroom. Mason collapsed onto one of the beds, exhaustion and pain medication pulling him quickly into sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours in vivid detail. The creature's impossible size, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it had toyed with us before attacking, none of it matched any animal I knew. Even calling it an animal felt wrong, somehow. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. As night fell completely, I closed the curtains and locked the door, checking it twice before allowing myself to stretch out on the unoccupied bed. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me for hours, my mind continuing to race with questions and theories about what we had encountered. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with glowing eyes and the sound of claws on wood, pursuing me through endless forest where every shadow concealed something hungry and patient. I awoke to bright sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains and the sound of Mason on the phone. He was speaking quietly, but I could make out enough to understand he was arranging for someone to retrieve his truck from the cabin. No, I can't go myself, he was saying. Doctor's orders, yeah, keys are hidden under the back bumper. Thanks, Ben. I owe you one. He ended the call and noticed I was awake. Morning, he said, looking marginally better than he had the previous day. Ben's going to bring my truck down. Should be here by this afternoon. Is that safe? I asked, sitting up. Sending someone else up there? Mason sighed, lowering himself carefully onto the edge of his bed. I told him to go during full daylight and not to stick around. Besides, what choice do we have? We need transportation, and all our stuff is still there. I couldn't argue with that logic, though I still felt uneasy about involving someone else. What's our plan once we have the truck? I need to report this, Mason said, his expression grim. Not to the local authorities, they clearly don't know what they're dealing with. But there are people who might. My grandfather wasn't the only one who knew about these things. Who? I pressed. There's a man in Boise, Mason explained. Native American elder, friend of my grandfather's. If anyone knows more about the skin teeths, it would be him. I considered this. So we're going to Boise? Mason nodded. As soon as Ben gets back with my truck, we spent the morning at the town's only diner, fueling up on strong coffee and greasy breakfast food. Mason was quiet, lost in thought, while I found myself studying every local who entered, wondering if they had their own encounters with the creatures in the woods. After breakfast, we returned to the motel to wait for Ben. The hours dragged by, and I could see Mason growing increasingly anxious as the afternoon wore on with no sign of his friend. "He should have been back by now," Mason muttered, checking his watch for the dozenth time. "It's a 3-hour round trip, Max." Another hour passed. Mason tried calling Ben's phone repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Mason finally stood up, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Something's wrong," he declared. "We need to find someone with a vehicle." I followed him out to the motel office where the bored-looking clerk barely looked up from her magazine as Mason explained our situation and asked if there was anyone in town who might give us a ride. "Tanner might," she said, reaching for the phone on the desk. "He does odd jobs, has an old Chevy that still runs." She dialed a number, had a brief conversation, then hung up. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. Charges $40 for a ride into the mountains, though." Mason agreed to the price without hesitation, and we waited outside the motel for our ride. The sky had clouded over, the earlier blue replaced by ominous gray that promised rain before nightfall. Tanner arrived driving a battered pickup that had once been blue but was now mostly rust. He was older than I expected, maybe in his 60s, with weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He greeted us with a nod and asked where we needed to go. "My family's cabin," Mason told him, providing directions. "A friend was supposed to retrieve my truck from there, but he hasn't returned." Something flickered in Tanner's eyes. Recognition, maybe? Or concern? "Near Black Pine Ridge?" When Mason nodded, Tanner's expression grew guarded. "Not many folks go up that way anymore, not since the troubles started." "Troubles?" I inquired, climbing into the truck's cramped back seat. Tanner put the truck in gear before answering. "Animals acting strange, people going missing, usual suspects blamed, bears, wolves, mountain lions, but locals know better." He glanced at us in the rearview mirror. "Your friend should have known better too." Mason leaned forward. "What do you know about what's up there?" The old man was silent for a long moment, guiding the truck out of town and onto the forest road. "My grandfather called them Wendigo," he finally said. "Old stories, spirit of hunger never satisfied, takes the form of something between man and beast." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering Mason's description of skin teeths. "Different name, same horror." "You've seen them?" Mason asked quietly. "Once," Tanner confirmed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 20 years ago. Logging crew I was with. Thing took 2 men before we even knew what was happening. Company called it a bear attack, closed the operation. But I saw it. We all did. "And nobody reported what really happened?" I asked incredulously. Tanner laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "To who? Forest Service? Police? Would you have believed it if someone told you before you saw it yourself?" He had a point. Even now, part of me wanted to rationalize what we'd seen. A mutated wolf, perhaps, or some undiscovered species. Anything but the reality of what had stalked us through those ancient woods. The drive seemed longer this time, the forest pressing closer to the road, branches reaching like grasping fingers. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof of the truck, and reducing visibility to mere yards ahead. "Not ideal conditions," Tanner commented as he slowed to navigate a particularly rough section of road. "Be dark in a couple hours, too." Mason checked his watch. "We should have time to find Ben and get back before nightfall." "And if your friend isn't at the cabin?" Tanner asked. The question hung in the air, unanswered. We all knew what it likely meant if Ben wasn't there. The truck labored up the final incline before Mason's family property, the engine protesting as Tanner urged it forward. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could make out the clearing ahead and the dark shape of the cabin. "There's Ben's truck," Mason said, pointing to a newer model Ford parked beside his own vehicle. Relief flooded his voice. He must still be inside. Tanner pulled up next to the other trucks and cut the engine but made no move to exit the vehicle. "Something ain't right," he muttered, staring at the cabin. I followed his gaze and noticed what had caught his attention. The cabin door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Even from here, I could see splintered wood where it had been damaged during our escape. "Ben," Mason called, opening his door despite Tanner's warning hand on his arm. "Ben, you in there?" Only the patter of rain answered him. Mason stepped out into the downpour, moving cautiously toward the cabin. I made to follow, but Tanner grabbed my wrist. "Let him go first." the old man advised, his voice tight with tension, "and be ready to move fast if needed." We watched as Mason approached the cabin, calling his friend's name again. He paused at the doorway, peering inside, then suddenly stiffened. "Oh God," he said, loud enough for us to hear even through the rain. "Alex, Tanner, stay back." Ignoring Tanner's grip, I pushed open the door and ran to join Mason, my shoes slipping on the muddy ground. I reached the cabin porch and looked past Mason into the dim interior, and immediately wished I hadn't. The cabin had been destroyed from within. Furniture lay shattered, the wood stove overturned, shelves torn from walls. But worst of all was the blood. Dark stains splashed across the floor and walls in violent patterns that told a story of desperate struggle. "Ben," Mason whispered, stepping cautiously into the wreckage. "Ben!" A low moan came from the far corner of the cabin behind the overturned bed. Mason rushed toward the sound, moving the heavy frame with strength born of desperation. Ben lay curled in the corner, his clothes torn and soaked with blood. Deep gasses ran across his chest and abdomen, and one arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "Jesus," Mason breathed, kneeling beside his friend. "Ben, can you hear me?" Ben's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with terror when he recognized Mason. It came back, he gasped, clutching at Mason's shirt with his uninjured hand. It was waiting, watching the cabin. "We need to get him out of here," I said, already moving to help lift the injured man. "Wait," Tanner called from the doorway, his voice sharp with alarm. "Listen." We froze, and in the relative silence I could hear what had caught Tanner's attention. The soft, deliberate sound of something large moving around the clearing outside. Not the random noises of wind and rain, but purposeful movement. "It's still here," Ben whispered, his voice breaking with fear. "It never left." Mason's face hardened with determination. "We need to get to the trucks. Now." Together we lifted Ben as gently as possible, supporting him between us as we moved toward the door. Tanner had retreated to his vehicle and already had the engine running. "Hurry," he urged, gesturing frantically. We were halfway across the clearing when a horrific howl split the air, louder even than the pounding rain. From the trees to our left emerged the nightmare creature from the previous day, the skin teeth, the Wendigo, whatever name best fit this abomination of nature. But it wasn't alone. A second creature, slightly smaller but no less terrifying, stepped from the forest on the opposite side of the clearing, and then a third, materializing like a shadow from behind Tanner's truck. "They're hunting in a pack," Mason realized, his voice hollow with desperation. We were surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run. Ben moaned in pain and terror, nearly a dead weight between us now. Tanner gunned his engine, spinning the truck around to face the nearest creature, but before he could do more, the beast lunged. It hit the side of the truck with enough force to rock the vehicle on its wheels. Glass shattered as massive claws ripped through the driver's side window. Tanner's scream was cut brutally short, and then the truck was moving, dragged sideways by the creature's impossible strength, Tanner's body visible through the windshield as he was pulled into the waiting jaws. "The cabin," I shouted, already turning back. "It's our only chance." We half-dragged, half-carried Ben back to the relative shelter of the damaged structure, Mason pushing the broken door shut behind us. It wouldn't hold against a determined attack, but it was better than nothing. "Help me with this," Mason ordered, already moving to shove the overturned wood stove against the door. Together we managed to barricade the entrance with what remained of the furniture. Ben lay where we'd placed him on the floor, his breathing increasingly labored. "They won't stop," he whispered. "Not until they have us all." Outside, the creatures circled the cabin, occasionally testing the walls and windows with powerful blows that made the entire structure shudder. They were toying with us again, I realized, savoring our fear, drawing out the hunt. "There has to be another way out," I insisted, searching the cabin for any escape route. "Mason, your family built this place. Is there anything? A cellar? A trapdoor? Anything?" Mason's eyes widened. "The root cellar. It connects to an old mining tunnel my grandfather showed me when I was a kid." He moved to the center of the cabin, pushing aside debris to reveal the trapdoor I'd noticed on our arrival. "It might lead far enough away to give us a chance." Hope flared briefly, only to be extinguished when one of the creatures slammed into the cabin wall with enough force to crack the logs. A clawed hand punched through the damaged wood, ripping away a section of wall large enough for the monster to begin forcing its way through. "Go!" Mason shouted, grabbing his pack and helping Ben toward the trapdoor. "I'll hold them off." "With what?" I demanded. Even as I pulled the heavy trapdoor open, Mason reached behind a fallen shelf and retrieved a red metal can, gasoline for the generator. "With this, and these." He produced a book of matches from his pocket. The realization of what he intended hit me like a physical blow. Mason, no. You'll never make it out. Neither will any of us if they get through before you're safely in the tunnel, he replied, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Get Ben out. Find the elder in Boise. Tell him what happened here. The creature had widened the hole in the wall enough to force its head and one shoulder through, jaws snapping at the air as it struggled to reach us. Its companions were attacking other sections of the cabin, the whole structure groaning under the assault. Mason, I began, but he cut me off. Go, he roared, already unscrewing the cap on the gasoline can. Now, I helped Ben down the ladder into the darkened cellar below, my heart breaking with each rung we descended. From above came the sound of liquid splashing, followed by Mason's voice, steady and defiant, challenging the creatures in their own language. A howl of pure human rage. The last thing I saw before closing the trapdoor was Mason, standing amid the ruins of his family's cabin, match raised, surrounded by spreading pools of gasoline and the encroaching forms of nightmare-made flesh. The underground darkness swallowed us just as a whoosh of flame ignited above, followed by inhuman shrieks of fury and pain. The trapdoor grew hot against my back as I leaned against it, tears streaming down my face for the friend who had sacrificed himself to give us a chance at survival. Ben's labored breathing drew me back to the present crisis. Using the flashlight on my phone, I surveyed our surroundings. A small root cellar with earthen walls and a narrow tunnel leading away into darkness. Can you walk? I asked Ben, who nodded weakly. I'll try, he gasped. But Alex, Mason, I know, I said, my voice breaking. I know, but we have to move. We have to make his sacrifice mean something. Supporting Ben as best I could, I led us into the tunnel, away from the inferno that had once been Mason's cabin, away from the monsters that had claimed our friend. The passage was low and narrow, forcing us to stoop as we moved deeper into the mountain. Above us, muffled by earth and stone, came the continuous howls of the creatures, sounds of rage, hunger, and the promise of relentless pursuit. The tunnel stretched before us, a narrow path carved through living rock. My phone's flashlight created a weak bubble of illumination that barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. Every few steps, I glanced back at the way we had come, expecting to see glowing eyes or the silhouettes of our pursuers. Ben stumbled beside me, each labored breath a reminder of how precarious our situation remained. His wounds continued to seep blood, leaving a trail that I knew would only make it easier for the creatures to follow once they decided to pursue us. How far does this tunnel go? I asked, hoping to distract him from the pain. Don't know, Ben gasped. Mason mentioned old mining operation, early 1900s. We continued in silence after that, conserving our strength for the journey. The tunnel occasionally branched, forcing me to make blind choices about which path to follow. I tried to maintain a consistent direction, away from the cabin, downhill whenever possible, toward what I hoped would eventually be safety. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the narrow passage widened into a larger chamber. The ceiling rose high enough that we could stand upright, and the remains of timber supports suggested this had once been a proper mining operation. Need to rest, Ben whispered, his face gray with pain and blood loss. I helped him sit against one wall, then checked his wounds as best I could in the dim light. The gashes were deep, and several showed signs of infection already. Red, inflamed edges and an unnatural heat radiating from the damaged tissues. We need to get you to a doctor, I said, knowing how inadequate the statement was. We were miles from civilization, trapped underground with monsters potentially on our trail. Ben managed a weak smile. Just need... catch my breath, I nodded, though I could see he was fading. Without medical attention soon he wouldn't survive, regardless of whether the creatures found us. A distant sound echoed through the tunnel, a scraping, followed by what might have been a low growl. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. They're coming, Ben whispered, his eyes wide with renewed terror. I helped him to his feet, ignoring his groan of pain. We need to keep moving. The chamber had 3 exits besides the one we had entered through. I chose the passage that seemed to slope downward most distinctly, hoping it would lead us toward the valley floor and eventually to a road or settlement. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when the sounds behind us grew louder. Definite movement now, the click of claws on stone, the low, rumbling breath of something large moving through confined space. There in the tunnels, I hissed, urging Ben to move faster despite his deteriorating condition. The passage narrowed again, forcing us to crouch and eventually to crawl. Ben's strength was failing rapidly, and I found myself practically dragging him forward. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, more urgent. The creatures had caught our scent and were closing the distance. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, the tunnel ahead lightened, and I felt a faint breeze on my face. An exit. With renewed determination, I pulled Ben toward the promise of freedom. The tunnel mouth appeared, a jagged opening partially concealed by brush and fallen rocks. Beyond it lay forest, the trees silvered by moonlight. Almost there, I encouraged, though Ben was barely conscious now. Just a little further, we emerged from the earth into a small ravine, the steep sides rising a dozen feet above us on either side. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and recent rain. For a moment I simply stood breathing it in, grateful to be above ground again. The moment of relief was shattered by a howl from the tunnel behind us, so close it made me jump. There was no time to rest or plan. I hoisted Ben over my shoulder in a firefighter's carry, staggering under his weight but driven by pure survival instinct. The ravine floor was uneven, strewn with rocks and fallen branches that threatened to trip me with every step. I followed its course downhill, knowing the geography of these mountains meant it would eventually join a larger creek or river valley. Behind us the howl was answered by others, the pack communicating, coordinating the hunt. I tried not to think about what that meant, focusing instead on each step, each breath, each moment of continued survival. The ravine widened gradually, the sides becoming less steep. Eventually it opened into a broader valley where a small stream gurgled over smooth stones. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patches of silver amid the darkness. Ben had stopped responding to my questions or encouragements. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. I knew I should stop and check his condition, but the sounds of pursuit drove me forward. The creatures were gaining on us, and our only hope lay in finding help or shelter before they caught up. I followed the stream, my steps splashing through the shallow water in hopes of confusing our scent trail. The forest around us was alive with normal night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But underneath it all was the more sinister noise of larger beings moving with purpose through the trees. A light appeared through the forest ahead. Artificial, steady, the unmistakable glow of human habitation. Hope surged through me, giving my exhausted body new strength. I altered course toward the light, no longer trying to be quiet or cautious. Speed was all that mattered now. The trees thinned, and suddenly I was stumbling into a cleared area. A small cabin stood before me, light spilling from its windows onto a neat front yard. A pickup truck was parked to one side, and smoke rose from the chimney, signs of current occupation. "Help!" I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. "Please help us." The cabin door flew open, and a figure appeared, silhouetted against the light from inside. A man raised what looked like a shotgun, pointing it in my direction. "Who's there?" he called, voice gruff with suspicion. "State your business, please," I gasped, staggering forward with Ben still draped over my shoulder. "My friend is hurt. We were attacked in the woods." The man lowered his weapon slightly, peering at us through the darkness. Attacked by what? Before I could answer, a howl rose from the forest behind us, closer than I had realized, and filled with a terrible hunger. The man's posture changed instantly, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Get inside," he ordered, raising the shotgun again but aiming it past us toward the trees. Now! I didn't need to be told twice. I carried Ben the final few yards to the cabin, the man backing up to let us through the door before following and slamming it shut. Heavy bolts slid into place as he secured it. "Put him there," the man directed, nodding toward a worn couch against one wall. I laid Ben down as gently as possible, finally getting a good look at him in the proper light. His face was ashen, his clothes soaked with blood, both dried and fresh. The gashes across his chest were even worse than I'd feared, deep enough to expose muscle and in one place the white gleam of rib bone. "Jesus Christ," the man muttered, taking in Ben's condition. "What did this to him?" "Something in the woods," I replied, unwilling to sound insane by describing what we'd actually seen. "It killed our friend. Would have killed us too if we hadn't escaped through an old mine tunnel." The man's weathered face showed no surprise, only grim recognition. "The old Mackenzie mine comes out about half a mile from here." He moved to a cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit. "These wounds need more than bandages, but it's a start." As he began cleaning and dressing Ben's injuries, I took stock of our surroundings. The cabin was small but well maintained, with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and doors leading to what I presumed were a bedroom and bathroom. Rifles and shotguns hung on one wall, alongside fishing gear and hunting trophies. "I'm Ray Dawson," the man said as he worked. "Retired forest ranger, been living out here 15 years. "Alex," I replied. My friend is Ben. The one who didn't make it was Mason. It was his family's cabin where we were staying. Ray's hands paused briefly. Mason Brewer? The Brewer cabin up on Black Pine Ridge? I nodded, surprised. You knew him? Knew his grandfather better, Ray said, resuming his first aid efforts. Good man. Understood what lives in these mountains. A heavy silence fell between us, broken only by Ben's labored breathing and the occasional crackle from the wood stove. Outside, something moved past the window, a shadow darker than the night, massive and deliberate in its movements. They followed you here, Ray observed, his voice unnaturally calm. I'm sorry, I said, a fresh wave of guilt washing over me. I didn't know where else to go. Ray shook his head. Not your fault, they've been getting bolder lately, more aggressive. Used to be they'd stay in the deep wilderness, only come near people in the worst winters when game was scarce. He finished bandaging Ben and stood, moving to check the windows. Now they're hunting humans deliberately, like they've developed a taste for it. What are they? I asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted me since our first encounter. Ray considered me for a long moment before answering. Different tribes have different names for them. Skin teeths, Wendigo. The old Salish people who lived here first called them Stekets, wild men of the mountains. But names don't much matter. What matters is they're old, they're smart, and they're hungry. How do we stop them? I pressed. Ray laughed a short, bitter sound. You don't. You avoid them, you hide from them, or you die. Only thing that keeps them at bay is fire, and even that's just temporary. A loud thump against the cabin wall made us both jump. Something large was testing the structure, probing for weaknesses just as it had at Mason's cabin. They remember what happened at the other cabin, Ray muttered, retrieving a shotgun from the wall rack. They'll be more cautious this time. The attack, when it came, was coordinated and frighteningly intelligent. One creature slammed repeatedly into the front door while another clawed at the roof, creating a distraction while a third began methodically tearing at the logs of the back wall. Ray fired through a window, the shotgun blast momentarily driving back the creature at the door. But they quickly returned, their assault becoming more focused, more determined. We can't hold them off forever, Ray said grimly, reloading his weapon. And your friend needs a hospital. Do you have a vehicle? I asked, gesturing toward the truck I'd seen outside. Ray nodded. Won't do us much good if we can't get to it. A new sound joined the cacophony of the attack, the splintering of wood as claws finally broke through the rear wall of the cabin. Ray swore, pumping his shotgun and firing at the emerging limb. The creature howled in pain but continued its assault, driven by a hunger that outweighed even self-preservation. We need a diversion, Ray decided, moving to a cabinet beside the stove. He retrieved several red emergency flares and handed them to me. These burn hot and bright. The creatures hate them. When I say go, head for the truck. I'll be right behind you with your friend. I nodded, gripping the flares tightly. Ray returned to the window, timing his shots to coincide with the creature's approaches. The wall behind us continued to splinter, gaps appearing between logs that had stood solid for decades. Get ready, Ray warned, reaching for something on a high shelf, a metal can with a homemade label. When I throw this, light a flare and run for the truck. Don't stop. Don't look back. I positioned myself by the door, one hand on the bolt, the other clutching a flare. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a countdown to what might be our final attempt at escape. Now! Ray shouted, hurling the can toward the damaged wall. It burst on impact, releasing a cloud of pungent liquid that immediately caught fire from a match Ray had struck. The flames spread rapidly, and the creature attacking the wall screamed in pain and rage. I slid back the bolt, lit the flare with trembling hands, and yanked open the door. The night outside was chaos. Massive shapes moving through darkness, glowing eyes reflecting the flare's crimson light. I held the burning stick before me like a talisman, sweeping it in wide arcs as I sprinted toward the truck. Behind me, Ray emerged from the cabin, Ben slung over his shoulder just as I had carried him earlier. In his free hand, he held a flaming branch from the wood stove, waving it to keep the creatures at bay. I reached the truck first, yanking open the driver's door and scrambling inside. The keys hung from the ignition, a small mercy in our desperate situation. I started the engine as Ray arrived with Ben, helping load the injured man into the back seat before climbing in himself. Go, he ordered, slamming his door shut just as a creature lunged toward the vehicle. Massive claws raked down the side of the truck, leaving deep gouges in the metal. I slammed the accelerator, and we lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. The truck leaped ahead, nearly hitting a tree before I managed to steer it onto the narrow track that served as Ray's driveway. In the rearview mirror, I could see the cabin burning, flames engulfing the structure as the creatures circled it in frustration. One broke away from the others, dropping to all fours as it began to pursue our vehicle. "It's following us," I shouted over the roar of the engine. Ray twisted in his seat, looking back through the rear window. "Just drive," he instructed, his voice steady despite the terror of our situation. "Road gets better about a mile ahead. They're fast, but they can't outrun a truck on open ground." I focused on the rough track ahead, steering around potholes and fallen branches, pushing the truck as fast as I dared on the uneven surface. The headlights illuminated only a short distance ahead, leaving the rest in darkness that seemed to press against the vehicle from all sides. A heavy impact rocked the truck. The pursuing creature had caught up enough to swipe at the rear bumper. Ray swore, rolling down his window and leaning out with his shotgun. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the cab, but it had the desired effect. The creature fell back, momentarily stunned or wounded. The track widened suddenly, the surface improving from rutted dirt to packed gravel. I pressed the accelerator harder, and the truck responded, putting distance between us and the nightmare behind. "Town's about 15 miles ahead," Ray said, keeping watch out the rear window. "Hospital's small, but they can stabilize your friend until he can be transferred somewhere with better facilities." I nodded, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles showed white. Ben made a weak sound from the back seat. Still alive, still fighting, though for how much longer I couldn't say. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, the forest gradually thinning as we approached more populated areas. Occasionally, Ray would instruct me to turn at a junction, guiding us toward town by the most direct route. "Will they follow us into town?" I asked as the first scattered houses appeared along the roadside. Ray shook his head. "Not their territory. Too many people, too much light. They prefer the deep woods, places humans rarely go. But they're getting bolder," I reminded him, recalling his earlier words. "Yes," he admitted grimly, "and that worries me more than anything." The small hospital appeared ahead, a single-story building with an illuminated emergency entrance. I pulled up to the doors and honked repeatedly, drawing the attention of staff inside. Within moments, medical personnel were rushing out with a gurney. "Animal attack," Ray explained as they transferred Ben from the truck. "Multiple lacerations, significant blood loss, probable internal injuries." They whisked Ben away, a doctor already calling for blood and antibiotics as they disappeared through the automatic doors. Ray and I followed, finding ourselves in a small waiting area with uncomfortable plastic chairs and outdated magazines. A nurse approached with clipboard and forms, asking for details about Ben's injuries and medical history. I provided what little information I knew, conscious of Ray's warning glance whenever the nurse pressed for specifics about the attack. "Bear," I said eventually, the lie tasting bitter but necessary. It was a bear. The nurse seemed satisfied with this explanation, making a note before hurrying back to the treatment area. Ray and I were left alone in the waiting room, the events of the past hours finally catching up to me in a wave of exhaustion and delayed shock. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ray sighed, rubbing a hand across his weathered face. "Now we wait, for news about your friend, for mourning, for whatever comes next. And the creatures? The skin teeths? They'll retreat back into the deep wilderness for now," he replied. "But they won't forget, and they won't stop hunting, not now that they've developed a taste for us." I thought of Mason, of his final stand in the burning cabin, of Tanner, torn from his truck in seconds, of Ben fighting for his life in the emergency room. All casualties of something most people didn't even believe existed. "Someone needs to stop them," I said, the words emerging as a statement rather than a question. Ray studied me for a long moment before responding. "It would take more than just someone," he said finally. "It would take knowledge, preparation, and numbers. Most of all, it would take belief, getting people to accept what's really out there in the darkness." Outside the hospital windows, the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. A new day was coming, but I knew the night would return, and with it the creatures that had claimed my friend and nearly claimed me. "I believe," I said simply, "and I know others will too, once they hear what happened." Ray nodded slowly, a flicker of something like hope crossing his lined face. "Then maybe there's a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless." We sat in silence after that, waiting for news of Ben, waiting for the sun to fully rise and push back the shadows. But even as daylight spread across the small town, I knew the darkness remained in the mountains beyond, patient, hungry, and watching for its next opportunity to feed. The hospital clock ticked steadily, marking minutes that stretched into hours. Sunrise brought a shift change at the facility, fresh-faced staff replacing the night crew who had worked to stabilize Ben. At some point, a sympathetic nurse brought us coffee in paper cups, scalding hot and bitter, but welcome nonetheless. Just before 8, a doctor emerged from the treatment area, his surgical scrub stained with blood. Ray and I stood simultaneously, bracing for whatever news he brought. "Your friend is stable," the doctor began, fatigue evident in his voice. "We've closed the worst of the lacerations and given him blood transfusions, but he's going to need more extensive care than we can provide here. We're arranging to have him airlifted to Spokane as soon as the weather clears." Relief washed through me, momentarily weakening my knees. "He's going to make it?" The doctor's expression remained cautious. "He's young and strong, which helps. But those wounds, I've been practicing medicine in these mountains for 15 years, and I've never seen animal attacks like the ones I've treated these past few months." Ray and I exchanged glances, but neither of us contradicted the animal attack narrative. "Can we see him?" I asked. The doctor nodded. "Briefly. He's heavily sedated but conscious." We followed him through swinging doors into a small treatment room where Ben lay surrounded by monitors and IV stands. His chest was wrapped in thick bandages and his skin was unnaturally pale against the white hospital sheets. Despite the doctor's warning, his eyes were alert, finding us as we entered. "Alex," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You made it." I moved to his bedside, careful not to disturb any of the equipment keeping him alive. "We both did. They're going to fly you to Spokane soon, to a bigger hospital." Ben's eyes moved to Ray, questioning. "Ray Dawson," I explained. "He helped us, saved us." Ben managed a weak nod of acknowledgement before his gaze returned to me. "Mason?" he asked, though I could tell from his expression that he already knew the answer. "He didn't make it," I confirmed gently. "He gave his life so we could escape." Ben closed his eyes briefly, grief passing across his features. When he looked at me again, there was a new intensity in his gaze. "What were those things, Alex? They weren't animals. They weren't—" "I know," I said, glancing at the doctor who was reviewing Ben's chart nearby. "We'll talk about it when you're stronger." Ben seemed to understand my reluctance to speak openly. He nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "Don't let them cover it up," he whispered. "People need to know what's out there." "I won't," I promised, squeezing his hand gently. "Rest now. Focus on getting better." The doctor approached, checking Ben's vital signs. "That's enough for now," he said firmly. "He needs to conserve his strength for the transfer." We said our goodbyes, promising to visit Ben in Spokane once he was settled. As we left the treatment room, a commotion at the hospital's main entrance caught our attention. 2 sheriff's deputies were speaking with the receptionist, their expressions serious. "They'll want statements," Ray murmured, watching the officers. "About what happened at my cabin, at the Brewer place." "What do we tell them?" I asked, feeling suddenly trapped. The truth would sound insane, but lies felt like a betrayal of Mason's sacrifice. Ray considered this. As much of the truth as they can handle. Animal attacks, multiple assailants. Leave out the details that would get us psychiatric evaluations rather than police reports. The deputies spotted us and approached, introducing themselves as Deputies Collins and Reeves. Their questions were initially straightforward. Our names, our relationship to the injured man, what had brought us to this remote area. Then came the harder questions about what had happened at Mason's cabin and later at Ray's. Ray took the lead, describing a series of attacks by what he carefully termed unidentified predators, large, aggressive, and hunting in packs. He emphasized the destruction they had caused, the ferocity of their assaults, and their apparent targeting of human habitations. "Not typical animal behavior," Deputy Collins noted, his pen hovering over his notepad. "No," Ray agreed, "not typical at all." "And your friend, Mason Brewer, you believe he perished in the fire at his cabin?" Deputy Reeves asked, directing the question to me. I nodded, throat tight with emotion. "He stayed behind so we could escape. Created a diversion." "We'll need to send a forensic team up there," Collins said to his partner. "See if we can recover remains, determine cause of death." "Good luck with that," Ray muttered. "Place would have burned to the ground by now, and those things might still be in the area." The deputies exchanged glances, clearly skeptical of the threat Ray was describing. "We'll coordinate with Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife," Collins said. "If there are dangerous predators in the area, they need to be located and dealt with." After taking our contact information and instructing us not to leave town without checking in, the deputies departed. Ray and I stood in the hospital lobby, both aware that the authorities would find nothing they could explain or understand when they investigated the cabin sites. "They won't believe it," I said quietly. "Not until they see for themselves. And by then it might be too late for whoever they send up there," Ray replied grimly. We left the hospital and walked to a nearby diner. both of us desperately in need of real food and a chance to regroup. The small restaurant was busy with the breakfast crowd, locals starting their day with coffee and conversation, unaware of the horrors that lurked in the mountains surrounding their town. We claimed a booth in the corner, ordering coffee and the breakfast special without really looking at the menu. Ray seemed lost in thought, staring out the window at the mountains visible in the distance. "You mentioned someone in Boise," I said, recalling Mason's words before everything had gone so terribly wrong. "A Native American elder who might know more about these creatures." Ray nodded slowly. "Joseph Running Bear. He and Mason's grandfather were friends, studied the old stories together. If anyone knows how to fight these things, it would be Joseph." "Then that's where I need to go next," I decided. "To Boise, to find this man." Ray studied me across the table. "You sure about that? You've survived 2 encounters with the skin teeths. Most people wouldn't tempt fate a 3rd time." "Mason died so we could escape and warn others," I replied, my resolve strengthening as I spoke. "I owe it to him to follow through with that. Besides," I added grimly, "these things are getting bolder, hunting humans deliberately. How long before they start coming down from the mountains into more populated areas?" Our food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. I realized suddenly how ravenous I was, my body demanding fuel after the ordeal of the past 24 hours. We ate in silence for several minutes before Ray spoke again. "If you're serious about this, you shouldn't go alone," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I've dealt with these creatures before. Know their habits, their weaknesses, what few they have." I looked up in surprise. "You'd come with me?" Ray nodded, his weathered face set in determined lines. "My cabin's gone, nothing left for me here now except memories. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "someone's got to keep you from getting yourself killed." A weight lifted from my shoulders. The prospect of having an ally, someone who understood what we were facing and who believed me without question, was more reassuring than I could express. "Thank you," I said simply. Ray waved away my gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead, and no guarantee of success at the end of it." We finished our meal and left the diner, stepping into the growing bustle of the small town beginning its day. The sunlight seemed to mock the darkness we had experienced, the ordinary activity of people going about their lives a stark contrast to the life-or-death struggle we had endured. Ray suggested we find a motel and get some rest before beginning the journey to Boise. My body readily agreed, exhaustion hitting me like a physical blow now that the immediate danger had passed. We checked into the same motel where Mason and I had stayed just days earlier, a lifetime ago it seemed. In the small generic room, I showered, watching dirt and dried blood swirl down the drain. Every muscle ached, and new bruises were blooming across my skin, souvenirs of our desperate flight through the forest. When I emerged, Ray was sitting on one of the beds, a battered journal open on his lap. "What's that?" I asked, toweling my hair dry. "Notes," he replied, turning a page. "Been keeping track of incidents over the years. Sightings, attacks, patterns. Thought it might help to review it before we meet with Joseph." I sat on the opposite bed, curiosity momentarily overcoming fatigue. "And, what patterns have you found?" Ray sighed, closing the journal. "They're territorial, but their territory is expanding. Used to be they stayed in the deepest wilderness, only came near settlements during harsh winters when game was scarce. Now they're approaching cabins, homes on the outskirts of towns, and they're coordinating their attacks more effectively." "Evolving," I suggested. "Adapting, or remembering," Ray countered. "The old stories say they were once more numerous, more aggressive, that they retreated into the high country only after humans became too many, too well armed. Maybe they're just returning to old ways." The thought sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the room. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. How do you fight something like that? Something that survived for centuries, adapting and evolving to become the perfect predator. Ray didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with the weight of knowledge accumulated over a lifetime in these mountains. "You find its weakness. Everything that lives has one. Even immortal monsters." I turned my head to look at him. "And if they don't have a weakness, then humanity is in more trouble than it realizes," he replied simply. Sleep claimed me soon after, dragging me into a darkness filled with distorted dreams of massive shapes moving through endless forest, of Mason's face as he prepared to sacrifice himself, of Ben's blood-soaked form lying in that sterile hospital bed. I woke several times, gasping and disoriented, before finally falling into a deeper, dreamless slumber. When I next opened my eyes, the light coming through the motel curtains had the golden quality of late afternoon. Ray was gone, but a note on the nightstand informed me he had gone to secure transportation and supplies for our journey to Boise. I dressed in clothes he had apparently purchased for me. Simple jeans and a flannel shirt that were close enough to my size to be comfortable. I ventured outside, blinking in the sunlight that seemed too bright, too normal after what we had experienced. The small town continued its routine existence, people going about their daily lives with no knowledge of the ancient predators that lurked in the mountains overlooking their homes. Ray returned an hour later driving a used SUV, its cargo area loaded with supplies. "Your vehicle?" I asked as he parked beside the motel. "Bought it off a widow in town," he explained. "Her husband passed last winter, and she had no use for it. Gave me a fair price." "You're really committed to this," I observed. Ray's expression hardened. "Those things killed my friends, destroyed my home, and they're getting bolder. Damn right I'm committed." We loaded our few personal belongings into the vehicle and checked out of the motel. Before leaving town, we stopped at the hospital for an update on Ben. The news was positive. He had been airlifted to Spokane and was reported stable, though still critical. The doctor provided the name of the receiving hospital so we could check on his progress from Boise. As we drove out of town, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief to be putting distance between ourselves and the creatures that had nearly killed us. Dread at the knowledge that we were deliberately seeking more information about them, potentially drawing their attention once again. The drive to Boise would take several hours, much of it through remote country similar to where we had encountered the skin teeths. Neither of us mentioned it, but I noticed Ray checked the rearview mirror more often than necessary, and both of us grew tense whenever the road wound through particularly dense forest. "Tell me about Joseph Running Bear," I said as we crossed the state line into Idaho, the mountains gradually giving way to more open terrain. "How does he know about these creatures?" Ray kept his eyes on the road as he spoke. "Joseph is a keeper of stories. His people have lived in these mountains for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. They knew about the skin teeths, had ways of protecting themselves, rituals to keep the creatures at bay. And these rituals worked?" I asked skeptically. Ray shrugged. "The tribes survived, generation after generation, in the same territories where these things hunted. Must have worked well enough. So why hasn't anyone used these methods since? Why aren't they common knowledge?" "Progress," Ray said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "When settlers came, they dismissed the natives' warnings as superstition, thought their guns and civilization would protect them, and for a while maybe they did. The creatures retreated deeper into the wilderness, became less of an immediate threat. Until now," I finished. "Until now," Ray agreed grimly. We drove in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts as the landscape changed around us. The sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on me. Darkness meant vulnerability, a primal fear now etched into my consciousness. We reached Boise after nightfall. The city lights a welcome sight after hours on remote highways. Ray navigated to a modest motel on the outskirts, explaining that Joseph lived on the Nez Perce Reservation about an hour north of the city. "We'll rest tonight, find him tomorrow," Ray said as we checked in. "Better to approach him in daylight, with clear heads." I didn't argue, my body still recovering from the ordeal of the past days. After a simple dinner at a nearby diner, we retired to our rooms, Ray promising to wake me early for the final leg of our journey. Sleep came easier than I expected, perhaps because of the relative safety of the city, or perhaps because my body had simply reached its limit. I dreamed again, but this time not of monsters and death. Instead, I saw Mason as he had been before our fateful trip, laughing, alive, unaware of the destiny that awaited him in his family's cabin. Morning arrived, with Ray knocking on my door, already dressed and ready to depart. We ate breakfast at the same diner, then hit the road again, heading north toward the reservation. The drive took us through rolling hills and farmland, the landscape different from the dense forests where we had encountered the skin teeths. The reservation appeared ahead, marked by a simple sign. Ray seemed to know where he was going, navigating the network of roads with confidence until we reached a small house set apart from its neighbors, surrounded by a garden of native plants and herbs. "This is it," Ray said, parking in front. "Joseph's place." We approached the door, and before we could knock, it opened to reveal an elderly man with long silver hair tied back in a neat ponytail. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as they moved from Ray to me and back again. "Raymond Dawson," he said, his voice surprisingly strong for his apparent age. "It has been many years." Ray nodded respectfully. "Too many, Joseph. I'm sorry it takes trouble to bring me to your door." Joseph's gaze shifted to me. "And you bring a new friend, who carries the shadow of the Deep Ones upon him." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "Deep Ones? Another name for what you encountered," Ray explained. Joseph, this is Alex. He and I are survivors of attacks by the skin teeths. His friend Mason Brewer wasn't so fortunate. Joseph's expression softened slightly. William Brewer's grandson, I am sorry to hear this. He stepped back from the doorway. Come inside, we have much to discuss. The interior of Joseph's home was warm and comfortable, decorated with a mix of traditional Native American items and modern furnishings. He led us to a small sitting area and gestured for us to be seated while he prepared tea. When he returned with steaming mugs, he settled into an armchair across from us. Tell me everything, he instructed. Leave nothing out, no matter how strange it may seem. I began the story, starting with Mason's invitation to visit his cabin and proceeding through every terrifying detail of our encounters with the creatures. Joseph listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When I described Mason's sacrifice, a shadow of grief passed over the old man's features, but he remained silent. Ray added his part of the narrative, the attack on his cabin, our desperate escape to town, and our decision to seek Joseph's guidance. When we had finished, Joseph sat quietly for several minutes, staring into his mug as if the answers we sought might be found in the tea leaves. They are growing bolder, he finally said, confirming what we already knew. Moving beyond their traditional hunting grounds, coordinating their attacks with greater intelligence than they have shown in generations. Why now? I asked. What's changed? Joseph sighed, setting his mug aside. Many things. The climate shifts, changing the patterns of other game they would normally hunt. Human expansion into previously remote areas. And perhaps they simply sense weakness, opportunity. Can they be stopped? Ray asked bluntly. Joseph's eyes met his. Not easily. Not without cost. He rose and moved to a bookshelf, retrieving an old, leather-bound volume. My ancestors recorded their knowledge of these creatures, passed down through countless generations. The deep ones, the skin teeths, they are ancient, perhaps as old as humanity itself. Natural predators of our kind, evolving alongside us. He opened the book, revealing pages of handwritten text in a language I didn't recognize, interspersed with detailed drawings. One illustration in particular caught my eye, a depiction of a creature exactly like those we had encountered, rendered with chilling accuracy. According to our stories, they cannot be killed by ordinary means, Joseph continued. Bullets may wound them, fire may drive them back, but they heal quickly and return, more cautious but no less determined. So there's nothing we can do? I asked, despair creeping into my voice. Joseph closed the book carefully. I did not say that. There are methods, rituals developed over centuries of coexistence with these predators, ways to mark boundaries they will not cross, to create safe havens against their hunting. Like what? Ray pressed. Combinations of certain herbs and minerals that repel them when burned. Symbols carved into trees or posts at the perimeter of settlements. Animal sacrifices left at specific locations to satisfy their hunger without risking human lives. Joseph's expression was serious. But these are temporary measures, not solutions. What about killing them? I asked. Permanently, Joseph studied me for a long moment. There are stories of successful hunts, yes. Special weapons blessed by tribal shamans. Traps designed to hold them long enough for fire to do its work completely. But such hunts required many warriors, careful planning, and acceptance that not all who participated would return. The gravity of what we were contemplating settled over the room like a physical weight. We were discussing hunting creatures that had survived centuries, perhaps millennia, adapting and evolving specifically to prey on humans. You should understand, Joseph added, that my people never sought to eradicate the deep ones entirely. They are part of the natural order, apex predators with their place in the balance of things. We sought only to maintain boundaries to ensure each species could exist in its own territory without constant conflict. That balance is broken now, Ray pointed out. They're actively hunting humans, coming closer to populated areas. If we don't stop them, more people will die. Joseph nodded sadly. Yes. And in this modern world, if enough people become aware of their existence, the response will be as it always is, fear leading to hatred, hatred leading to extermination. With modern weapons and technology, humanity could likely succeed where previous generations could not. Would that be so terrible? I asked, thinking of Mason's death. Of Ben's horrific injuries. Joseph fixed me with a penetrating gaze. Every species that disappears leaves a hole in the web of life. The deep ones have been predators of humans for so long that we cannot know what their absence might mean. But more practically, he continued, hunting them would be dangerous beyond imagining. They are intelligent, patient, and utterly without mercy. They would recognize a coordinated effort to eliminate them and respond in kind. The implications were chilling, not isolated attacks on remote cabins, but coordinated assaults on towns, villages, perhaps even cities. A war between human and proto-human predators that would leave countless dead on both sides. "So what do you suggest?" Ray asked, his voice tight with frustration. Joseph considered the question carefully before responding. "A middle path, re-establish boundaries, drive them back to their traditional territories using methods my ancestors developed. Create protected zones around human settlements that they will learn to avoid." "And if that doesn't work?" I pressed. "If they continue to hunt humans despite these boundaries, then more drastic measures may be necessary," Joseph acknowledged grimly. "But let us try the wisdom of the ancients before reaching for modern weapons of destruction." He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he retrieved several small cloth bags and a rolled parchment. "These contain herbs and minerals that repel the deep ones when burned," he explained, handing the bags to Ray. "And this," he indicated the parchment, "shows the symbols to be carved on boundary markers. Place them at intervals of 100 paces around the area you wish to protect." Ray accepted the items with reverence. "Thank you, Joseph." "Do not thank me yet," the old man cautioned. "This is merely the beginning of a long and dangerous path. You will need allies, knowledge, and courage in equal measure." "Mason's grandfather," I said suddenly, remembering. "He knew about these creatures too. Did he leave any records, any information that might help us?" Joseph nodded slowly. "William Brewer was a wise man who respected the old ways. He maintained a journal of his research and encounters with the skin teeths. If it survived the destruction of the cabin, it would be invaluable." Ray and I exchanged glances, both remembering the burning cabin where Mason had made his last stand. The chances of anything surviving that inferno seemed slim, but it was worth investigating once we returned to Montana. "There is one more thing you should know," Joseph said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "The deep ones are not simply animals. They possess an intelligence that approaches our own, and some of the oldest stories suggest they once had their own culture, their own rituals. Some even speak of communication between our kinds in the distant past." This new information sent a chill through me. "You're saying they're sentient? Sapient?" "I am saying we do not fully understand what they are," Joseph replied carefully. "And in our ignorance we should proceed with caution, respecting them as worthy adversaries rather than mere beasts to be hunted." We spoke for hours more, Joseph sharing what knowledge he had about the creature's habits, weaknesses, and history. By the time we prepared to leave, afternoon had turned to evening, and a plan was beginning to take shape. Not a solution, perhaps, but a starting point. "I will return with you to Montana," Joseph announced as we gathered our things. "These events have been foretold in our stories. It is time for me to take a more active role." Ray seemed surprised but grateful. "We welcome your help, old friend." Joseph packed a small bag with surprising efficiency for a man of his years. Before departing, he performed a brief ritual, burning a small bundle of herbs and murmuring words in his native language. "A prayer for protection during our journey," he explained. The drive back to Montana was tense but purposeful, our vehicle now carrying not just survivors but the beginnings of a response to the threat that had claimed Mason's life. Joseph sat in the back seat, occasionally consulting the ancient book he had brought with him, making notes in a small, modern notebook. "We should stop in Spokane," I suggested as we approached the city. "Check on Ben, update him on what we've learned." Ray and Joseph agreed, and we detoured to the hospital where Ben had been transferred. We found him much improved, sitting up in bed and alert, though still clearly in pain from his injuries. "Alex," he greeted me, genuine relief in his voice. "You came back." "Of course," I replied, taking a seat beside his bed while Ray and Joseph introduced themselves. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got mauled by a monster," Ben said with a weak attempt at humor. Which, is pretty accurate. His expression grew serious. "The police have been here asking questions. I stuck to the animal attack story, but I don't think they believed me entirely." "Probably not," Ray acknowledged, "but it buys us time." I explained to Ben what we had learned from Joseph, our plans to establish boundaries and push the creatures back into their traditional territories. Ben listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind despite his ordeal. "I want to help," he said when I had finished. "When I'm out of here, I'm coming to find you." Part of me wanted to discourage him. He had already suffered so much. But I saw the determination in his eyes, the same resolve that had developed in me since witnessing Mason's sacrifice. "We'll need all the help we can get," I told him honestly. We stayed only long enough to ensure Ben had our contact information and to promise updates on our progress. The doctors estimated he would be released in another week, though full recovery would take months. Back on the road, heading toward the mountains where our nightmare had begun, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Less than a week ago, I had been a normal person with normal concerns, work, relationships, the mundane details of everyday life. Now I was part of something ancient and terrible, a conflict between humanity and its natural predators that had been playing out in remote wilderness for centuries. "Are we ready for this?" I asked Ray as the first peaks of the Montana mountains appeared on the horizon. "Are we really ready to face those things again?" "No," he replied honestly. "But ready or not, they're out there. And if we don't stand against them, who will?" Joseph spoke from the back seat, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had lived with this knowledge. "No one is ever ready to face the darkness. We simply choose whether to face it on our feet or on our knees." The sun was setting as we crossed back into Montana, casting long shadows across the landscape. Somewhere in those deepening shadows, the skin teeths waited, hungry and patient as they had been for countless generations. But now they faced something new. Humans who understood what they were, who carried the knowledge of how to fight them, and who were determined to re-establish the ancient boundaries between predator and prey. I thought of Mason, of his final moments in that burning cabin. "We're coming back," I whispered to the mountains looming ahead. "And this time, we're ready." The road stretched before us, leading into darkness and uncertainty. But for the first time since that fateful howl had shattered the peace of Mason's clearing, I felt something beyond fear, a spark of purpose, of resolution. The skin teeths had existed for millennia, evolving alongside humanity as our shadows, our natural predators. But humanity had evolved too, developing knowledge, technology, and the capacity to share information across vast distances. This conflict was far from over. In many ways it was just beginning. But as our vehicle carried us back toward the wilderness where monsters roamed, I realized that the outcome was no longer certain. The hunt had changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and I intended to make sure Mason's sacrifice had not been in vain. It was a Tuesday, I think. I never kept track of days as much as I kept track of hours, and that Tuesday dragged on like the worst kind of shift. Small towns like Munden, Kansas, population about 200 and shrinking, don't offer a lot of excitement. You either end up becoming friends with the guy who owns the bar, or the guy who gets in a fight every night at the bar. I wasn't friends with either of them. The year was 1997, and at that time I was just a cop in a nowhere town. I didn't mind it. Quiet was good. Quiet meant people weren't being idiots, and I got to go home without a headache. No real crime, just the occasional drunk and, if we were lucky, a runaway cow from the Wilson farm. Hell, you could take a nap in your cruiser and nobody would notice. That particular Tuesday in late October had been especially dull. I'd spent most of the morning parked outside Donovan's general store, drinking coffee that tasted like motor oil and flipping through a worn paperback I'd read 3 times already. The afternoon was spent writing up a report on some mailboxes the writer kids had knocked over with baseball bats. Big-time crime in Munden. The station itself was barely more than a converted house with a holding cell in the back that we mostly used for storage. Sheriff Bennett was out for the week. Fishing trip up in Minnesota, which left me and Deputy Walsh to handle things. Walsh was off that day, so I was alone when the call came in. It was nearly sunset when Linda, our part-time dispatcher, radioed me about a disturbance. Her voice crackled through the static. "Got a call from Old Man Simons. Says he heard strange noises out near the abandoned Morrison place." I sighed and tossed my paperback onto the passenger seat. "What kind of noises?" "Didn't say exactly, just strange and not animal-like. Probably nothing, but we've got nothing better to do. I'll check it out." Everyone knew the Morrison house had been empty for over a decade. The last folks who lived there packed up and left without a word. Some said it was financial troubles. Others whispered about domestic disputes. I never paid much attention to the rumors. The place had a reputation among the local kids as being haunted, but the only spirits I cared about were the ones in a bottle. I drove slowly down Main Street, past the diner where the same 5 men sat every evening, past the boarded-up movie theater that had closed in '92, past the row of weathered houses with their American flags and porch swings. Everything so familiar it had become invisible to me after 7 years on the job. The sun was setting as I turned onto the county road that would take me out to the Morrison place. It sat about 3 miles outside of town, tucked back in the woods. The old house had been grand once, built by a lumber baron in the 1920s who thought Munden might become something. He was wrong. The wind picked up as I drove, sending dead leaves skittering across the road. The radio faded to static and I switched it off. In the growing darkness, the cornfields on either side of the road looked like an ocean of shadows, rippling and swaying in the wind. My headlights cut through the gloom, but beyond their reach was only darkness. I'd been out to the Morrison place a few times before, usually to chase off teenagers who thought it would be fun to drink beer in a supposedly haunted house. I'd never felt anything strange about the place. It was just a house, abandoned and forgotten, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But as I turned onto the dirt road that led to the property, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I chalked it up to the bad coffee and the approaching night. Nothing more. The dirt road narrowed as I drove, branches from the surrounding trees scraping against the sides of my cruiser. The headlights bounced off the trees, creating strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the branches. I slowed down, easing the car over the rutted path. When I rounded the final bend, the Morrison house came into view. In the fading light, it looked worse than I remembered. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood gray and rotten. Half the windows were broken and the front porch sagged dangerously to one side. Vines had claimed one entire wall, their tendrils pushing between the boards like fingers. I parked my cruiser in the clearing and sat for a moment, listening. The engine ticked as it cooled. Wind rustled through the trees. Nothing else. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, immediately feeling like I was being watched. Not haunted watched. More like someone was studying me, calculating. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. The feeling persisted. "Sheriff's Department," I called out, more out of habit than expectation of a response. "Anyone here?" My voice sounded small against the vastness of the surrounding woods. As the echo faded, the silence seemed to deepen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I approached the house slowly, my hand resting on my holster. The wooden steps of the porch creaked ominously under my weight. The front door hung at an angle, its bottom hinge broken. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. A damp, musty odor mixed with something else, something sour and wrong that made my nose wrinkle. I swept my flashlight across the entry hall. Debris littered the floor, fallen plaster, old newspapers, animal droppings. Water damage had warped the floorboards, and black mold crept up the walls like a disease. "Hello?" I called again. "Sheriff's Department. If anyone's here, make yourself known." As my voice echoed through the empty rooms, I heard a soft scuttling sound from somewhere deeper in the house. It could have been a raccoon or a possum, both common enough in abandoned buildings. But something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I moved further into the house, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Each room told the same story of neglect and decay. The kitchen had been stripped of anything valuable, cabinet doors hanging open like gaping mouths. The living room ceiling had partially collapsed, exposing rotting beams. As I approached the back of the house, that strange odor grew stronger. It reminded me of roadkill left too long in the summer sun, but worse, deeper, more pervasive. And beneath it was another smell, like wet fur mixed with something chemical. I was about to turn back, to write the call off as a waste of time, when I heard it again. That scuttling sound, but closer now. It came from behind a door at the end of the hallway. What would have been the study or den in a house like this? I approached slowly, listening. The sound had stopped, but I could hear something else now. A wet, rhythmic noise, like chewing. My stomach tightened as I reached for the doorknob. For a moment I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn around, to go back to my cruiser and radio for backup. But backup meant Walsh, and Walsh would never let me live it down if I called him out here for nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness of the study, revealing bookcases stripped of their contents and a massive oak desk overturned in the center of the room. The air was thick with that putrid smell, making me cover my nose with my sleeve. My eyes watered as I swept the light across the space. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, slumped against the wall, was a man. Or what remained of one. Even from the doorway I could tell he was dead. His torso had been torn open from sternum to navel, exposing ribs and internal organs. Blood pooled beneath him, black and congealed. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, eyes wide and glassy, mouth stretched in a silent scream. I'd seen dead bodies before, car accidents, heart attacks, even a suicide or two, but nothing like this. This wasn't a natural death. This wasn't even a murder in the conventional sense. This was savagery. I fumbled for my radio, but before I could call it in, my flashlight beam caught movement in the corner of the room. Something was hunched over the lower half of the corpse, partially obscured by the overturned desk. At first, I thought it was a large dog, maybe a coyote that had wandered in and found an easy meal. But as the light hit it, the thing looked up at me, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. This was no dog, no coyote, no animal I'd ever seen. It had a body roughly the size of a large man, but twisted and wrong. Its skin, what I could see of it beneath patches of slick matted fur, was a sickly grayish white, like something that had lived its entire life underground. Long, thin limbs ended in hands, yes, hands, not paws, with fingers too numerous and too long, tipped with curved, yellowed claws. But it was the face that paralyzed me with fear. It had a mouth that split its head almost in half, filled with jagged, needle-like teeth, still dripping with gore from its meal. Where its eyes should have been were just sunken pits, but somehow I knew it was looking at me, seeing me. For one endless moment, we stared at each other. Then it moved. It didn't stand so much as unfold itself, limbs straightening with a series of wet popping sounds. It rose up, taller than any man, its joints bending at impossible angles. Those legs, those long, crooked legs, were what made my heart stop. They were twisted like an insect's, almost spider-like, giving it a jerky, unnatural gait. I fumbled for my gun, my fingers numb with terror. By the time I got it out of the holster, the creature had already begun to move. It didn't charge at me like I expected. Instead, it scuttled sideways along the wall with surprising speed, its movements jerky and disjointed, as if its body couldn't quite agree on which way to go. "Stop!" I shouted. Though what I expected a monster to do with a police command, I couldn't tell you. "Stop or I'll shoot." It paused, cocking its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. For a fraction of a second, I thought it might understand me. Then it opened that horrific mouth and let out a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between, wet and guttural and utterly inhuman. I fired twice. The first shot went wide, splintering the bookcase behind it. The second hit it in the shoulder, or what passed for one. A dark, viscous liquid sprayed from the wound, but the creature barely seemed to notice. It lunged not toward me, but toward a hole in the wall I hadn't noticed before. A gaping tear in the rotting wood just above the floorboards. It seemed impossible that something so large could fit through such a small space. But the creature folded its limbs against its body and squeezed through with a series of disgusting, squelching sounds. In seconds it was gone, leaving only a smear of that dark fluid on the edge of the hole. I stood frozen, gun still raised, staring at the space where the monster had disappeared. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps that did nothing to calm me down. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to lower my weapon. My hands were trembling so badly I had to holster the gun before I accidentally shot myself. I backed toward the door, unwilling to turn my back on that hole in the wall. "Dispatch," I said into my radio, surprised to find my voice relatively steady. "I need backup at the Morrison place. I've got a homicide." I couldn't bring myself to mention what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Linda's voice came through, tinny and distant. "Copy that. What's the situation?" "Male victim, badly mutilated. Possible animal attack." The words felt hollow even as I said them. No animal I knew could do what had been done to that man. "Walsh is off tonight. I can try to reach him at home." "Do it," I said. "And call the county sheriff's office too. We need all hands on this." I kept backing up until I reached the hallway, then turned and moved quickly toward the front door. Every shadow seemed to hide another monster. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I kept my flashlight beam sweeping in wide arcs, terrified of what might be lurking just beyond its reach. As I neared the front of the house, I heard it again, that wet scuttling sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from beneath me. I froze, directing my flashlight beam at the floor. The old wooden boards creaked and then shifted slightly, as if something was pushing up from below. I remembered then that these old houses often had crawl spaces or even root cellars. Was that where it had gone? Was it directly beneath my feet? A board split with a sharp crack, and something pushed through the gap. A long, thin finger-like appendage, tipped with a yellowed claw. Then another. And another. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted for the front door, stumbling over debris in my haste. Behind me I heard the unmistakable sound of splintering wood as more boards gave way. Something was breaking through the floor, something big. I burst through the front door and down the porch steps, nearly falling as the rotten wood gave way beneath my weight. I sprinted to my cruiser, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside, slamming and locking it in one motion. Through the windshield, I could see the house, dark and silent. Nothing moved in the windows or doorway. But I knew it was in there, watching, waiting. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine made a weak whining sound but wouldn't catch. "Come on, you piece of junk!" I slammed my fist against the steering wheel in frustration. Of all the times for the car to fail, it had to be now, when I was sitting outside a house with a monster and a corpse. I tried the radio again. "Dispatch, my vehicle won't start. I'm stranded at the Morrison place with a possible suspect still in the area. I need immediate assistance." Static was my only answer. I checked the radio settings. Everything seemed normal, but no matter how I adjusted it, I couldn't get a signal. Movement at the edge of my vision made me whip my head around. Something was moving along the tree line at the edge of the property. A dark shape, low to the ground, slinking from shadow to shadow. I squinted, trying to make it out in the darkness. It was too far away to see clearly, but I knew, with a sick certainty, that it was the creature from inside. It had found another way out of the house, and now it was circling me, like a predator sizing up its prey. I checked my gun. Only 4 bullets left after the 2 I'd fired inside. Not enough if that thing decided to attack. I had a shotgun locked in the trunk, but to get to it, I'd have to leave the relative safety of the car. The shape moved again, closer this time. I could make out those spindly limbs, bending at unnatural angles as it circled. It seemed to be testing me, seeing if I would run. "Help is coming," I said aloud, trying to convince myself as much as anything. "Just stay in the car, they'll be here soon." But as I watched the creature's methodical movements, I realized 2 things with growing horror. Help was at least 20 minutes away, and I wasn't at all convinced the windows of my cruiser would keep that thing out if it really wanted to get in. I had to make a decision: stay and hope the car would protect me, or run and try to reach the main road where I might flag down a passing vehicle. Neither option seemed good, but sitting there watching that thing circle closer and closer was unbearable. I made my choice. I would run. The main road was about half a mile through the woods. If I could reach it, I might have a chance. I gripped the door handle, took a deep breath, and prepared to move faster than I ever had in my life. I waited until the creature moved to the far side of the clearing before making my move. With one fluid motion, I flung open the car door, sprinted to the trunk, and fumbled with my keys. Each second felt like an eternity as I unlocked the trunk, grabbed the shotgun, and slammed it shut again. A terrible screeching sound cut through the night. The creature had spotted me and was now racing across the clearing, moving with that jerky, unnatural speed. In the moonlight, it looked even more horrific than it had inside. A twisted parody of humanity, all wrong angles and too many limbs. I didn't waste time aiming. I fired the shotgun in its general direction and ran. The blast echoed through the trees, momentarily drowning out the sound of the creature's pursuit. I didn't look back to see if I'd hit it. I just ran. The path back to the main road was little more than a game trail, barely visible in the darkness. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the undergrowth. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, but fear was a powerful motivator, and I moved with a speed born of pure terror. Behind me, I could hear it coming. That awful, wet, scuttling sound, punctuated by the crack of breaking branches and an occasional inhuman shriek that made my skin crawl. It was following me, and from the sound of it, it was gaining. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't dare slow down. The image of that man in the house, torn open and half devoured, was all the incentive I needed to keep moving. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was maybe 30 yards behind me, bounding through the forest on all fours like some nightmarish spider. Its movements were jerky but incredibly fast, eating up the distance between us with each leap. I turned my attention back to the path and nearly ran headlong into a tree. I swerved at the last second, lost my footing on the uneven ground, and went sprawling. The shotgun flew from my grasp, disappearing into the underbrush. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet. Sprained, maybe broken, but I couldn't worry about that now. I limped forward, my pace significantly slowed. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. I grabbed my service revolver, turned, and fired twice more in quick succession. In the muzzle flash, I caught a glimpse of the creature ducking behind a tree, moving with an intelligence that terrified me even more than its appearance. This wasn't just a predator acting on instinct. This thing was thinking, planning. I kept moving, hobbling as fast as my injured ankle would allow. The main road couldn't be far now, maybe a quarter mile. If I could just reach it. The forest opened up suddenly into a small clearing, bathed in moonlight. I paused, momentarily disoriented. This wasn't right. The path to the road didn't pass through any clearings. I'd gone the wrong way. As the realization hit me, so did the creature. It slammed into me from behind with such force that I was lifted off my feet and thrown several yards. I landed hard, the air driven from my lungs in a painful whoosh. Before I could recover, it was on me. Its weight pinned me to the ground as those two long fingers wrapped around my throat. Its face, that horrible, inhuman face, hovered inches from mine, that split-wide mouth open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. The stench was overwhelming, rotting meat and something chemical, like formaldehyde or paint thinner. I gagged, struggling to breathe as its grip tightened around my throat. With my free hand, I still clutched my revolver. Summoning the last of my strength, I pressed the barrel against what I hoped was a vital area and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening at such close range. The creature released me and reeled back, emitting a high-pitched keening sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dark fluid sprayed from a wound in its side, spattering my face and chest with something that burned like acid where it touched bare skin. I scrambled backward, firing my last bullet as I moved. The shot went wide, disappearing into the darkness. The creature wasn't pursuing me, though. It thrashed on the ground, those long limbs flailing in what appeared to be genuine pain. I used the opportunity to put as much distance between us as possible, crawling backward until I hit the trunk of a large tree. My throat burned where it had gripped me, and my ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. But I was alive. The creature's movements slowed, then stopped altogether. It lay motionless in the center of the clearing, a dark heap against the moonlit grass. Had I killed it? I didn't dare hope. Time seemed to stretch as I sat there, watching the unmoving form, waiting for it to spring back to life. My breathing gradually slowed, and the pounding of my heart settled into a more regular rhythm. Maybe, just maybe, I'd won. Then, slowly, the creature stirred. It didn't leap up or charge at me as I feared. Instead, it seemed to melt into the ground, its body flattening and elongating in ways that defied anatomy. It slithered across the clearing, leaving a trail of that dark fluid, and disappeared into the underbrush at the far side. I remained frozen, listening as the sounds of its retreat grew fainter, then vanished altogether. Only when I was certain it was gone did I allow myself to collapse back against the tree, exhausted and in pain but immeasurably relieved. I'd survived. I'd faced that thing, whatever it was, and lived to tell the tale. Though who would believe me was another question entirely. With trembling hands, I checked myself for injuries. My ankle was swollen but not broken. My throat was bruised but intact. The spots where the creature's blood had touched me were red and blistered, but the pain was already subsiding. I needed to get back to the road, to find help, but I couldn't risk running into that thing again. I needed to be smart about this. Orienting myself by the moon, I determined the approximate direction of the main road and began to limp toward it. Every shadow made me flinch. Every sound sent a spike of fear through my heart. But nothing attacked me as I made my slow, painful way through the woods. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I emerged onto the county road. The asphalt looked silver in the moonlight, stretching away in both directions like a ribbon. In the distance, I could see headlights approaching, flashing red and blue. The backup I'd called for had finally arrived. I collapsed onto the shoulder of the road, waving my arms to flag down the approaching vehicle. As it drew closer, I recognized Walsh's personal truck with a magnetic police light stuck to the roof. Behind him came two county sheriff's cars, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Walsh was the first to reach me, jumping out of his truck with his gun drawn. "What the hell happened to you?" he demanded, taking in my disheveled appearance. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, but in the stark reality of the headlights, with Walsh's skeptical face looking down at me, the words died in my throat. Who would believe a story about a spider-like monster that ate people? They'd think I was drunk, or worse, crazy. "There's a body in the Morrison house," I said instead. "Badly mutilated. I surprised the attacker and it chased me into the woods. I think I wounded it, but it got away." "What kind of attacker?" Walsh asked, helping me to my feet. "Man? Animal?" I hesitated. "Animal, I think. Big. Didn't get a good look at it in the dark." Walsh eyed me suspiciously but didn't press the issue. The county sheriffs approached, and I repeated my story, keeping it simple and vague. An animal attack, a chase through the woods. Nothing about impossible anatomies or intelligence behind those eyeless sockets. They believed me, or at least pretended to. One of the deputies radioed for an ambulance while the others prepared to check out the house. I warned them to be careful, that the attacker might still be nearby. but I could see in their faces that they thought I was overreacting. As they headed toward the path leading to the Morrison place, I sat in the back of Walsh's truck, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders to combat the shock that was setting in. Through the trees, I could see their flashlights moving toward the house, growing smaller with distance. I wanted to call them back, to warn them again, but what could I say? Be careful of the monster that shouldn't exist? They'd already half convinced themselves I was hysterical or concussed. Anything more would only cement that impression, so I sat there, shivering despite the blanket, and waited. In my mind, I kept seeing those deputies walking into that house, finding that hole in the wall, and something reaching out for them, something with too many limbs and a mouth full of needle teeth. But nothing happened. 10 minutes later, they radioed back to confirm they'd found the body, just as I'd described it. No sign of the attacker. They were securing the scene for the medical examiner. Relief washed over me, tinged with confusion. Had the creature really fled, or was it just hiding, waiting for another opportunity? The ambulance arrived, and the EMTs checked me over. Bruised throat, sprained ankle, mild shock, nothing life-threatening. They wanted to take me to the hospital in the next county over, but I refused. I needed to stay, to see this through, to make sure that thing didn't hurt anyone else. As dawn broke over the trees, casting long shadows across the Morrison property, I sat on the bumper of Walsh's truck, watching the investigation unfold. The county medical examiner arrived, followed by more deputies and even a few state troopers. Word travels fast when something this gruesome happens in a small town. I gave my statement again and again, each telling more sanitized than the last. An animal attack, possibly a bear, though bears were rare in this part of Kansas. I fired at it, wounded it, and it ran off. Simple, believable, a lie. No one questioned me too closely. After all, who would make up a story about being attacked in the woods? And the evidence was there, the mutilated body, my injuries, the blood trail in the clearing, though the tests would later show it wasn't blood at all, but something the lab couldn't identify. By noon, I was back at the station, typing up my report. The official version, not what really happened. As I wrote, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that twisted shape moving through the shadows of Main Street, but there was only the normal bustle of town life. Mrs. Rodriguez walking her dog, the mailman making his rounds, children playing in the park, life going on, oblivious to the horror hiding in the woods. 3 days passed. The body was identified as Martin Grayson, a drifter who'd been passing through the area. No family to notify, no one to ask difficult questions about the official cause of death. Animal attack. My injuries healed quickly. The sprained ankle faded to a dull ache, and the bruises on my throat turned from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. But my mind wasn't healing. I couldn't sleep without seeing that face, that horrible split mouth, and those empty eye sockets somehow still watching me. I threw myself into work, taking extra shifts and volunteering for the overnight patrol that no one wanted. Anything to keep busy, to keep from thinking too much. The few times I did sleep, I woke up gasping, convinced that I could hear that wet scuttling sound outside my bedroom window. Walsh and the others gave me space. They attributed my behavior to the trauma of the attack, and I didn't correct them. Better they think I was shaken up by a bear than know I was losing my mind over a monster that couldn't possibly exist. But I knew what I saw. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It was about a week after the incident when Sheriff Bennett returned from his fishing trip. He called me into his office the moment he got back, his usually jovial face serious as he read through my report. "Animal attack, huh?" he said, setting the file down on his desk. "What kind of animal are we talking about here?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. Not sure. Big. Moved fast. Could have been a bear, I guess. Bennett leaned back, studying me with eyes that had seen 40 years of law enforcement. "We haven't had a bear in this county in 2 decades, and you know it." I said nothing, staring at a point just past his shoulder. "Walsh says you were pretty rattled when they found you. Says you looked like you'd seen a ghost. It was dark. I was being chased through the woods. Anyone would be scared." Bennett nodded slowly. Anyone would. But not everyone would empty their service weapon and a shotgun at whatever was chasing them. I couldn't argue with that. The evidence of my panic was there in the inventory. 6 shots fired from my revolver, 1 from the shotgun. "What really happened out there?" Bennett asked, his voice softening. "This is me you're talking to, not some report that's going to county." For a moment, I considered telling him everything. About the creature that moved like a spider but stood like a man. About the intelligence in its movements. About how it had been eating Grayson when I found it. But the words stuck in my throat. "I told you," I said finally. "Animal attack. I didn't get a good look at it. Bennett sighed, disappointment evident in his face. All right, have it your way. But if there's something out there dangerous enough to do what was done to Grayson, I need to know about it. I've got a town to protect. Yes, sir, I said, standing to leave. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. You do that, he replied, turning his attention back to the file. And take a couple days off. You look like hell. I didn't argue. I did take the days off, but I didn't rest. Instead, I drove back out to the Morrison place in my personal vehicle, parking a quarter-mile away and approaching on foot, gun in hand. The house looked different in daylight. Less menacing, more pathetic. Crime scene tape fluttered from the porch railings, and the front door had been sealed with more tape and a padlock. The medical examiner and crime scene techs had come and gone, taking Grayson's body and whatever evidence they could find with them. I circled the property, looking for any sign of the creature. There were official boot prints everywhere, of course, from the investigation team, but nothing unusual. No strange tracks, no trail of that dark fluid I still couldn't identify. I found the hole in the wall where the creature had escaped, now marked with an evidence tag. It seemed even smaller in daylight, impossible for something so large to fit through. Yet I'd seen it happen. Beyond the hole was a narrow crawl space beneath the house, dark and musty. I shone my flashlight into it but saw nothing except dirt and old cobwebs. If the creature had been living there, it was gone now. I spent hours combing the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of its passage. But if it had left any trail, the investigators had trampled it beyond recognition. Or maybe it was smarter than I gave it credit for, careful not to leave evidence of its existence. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly headed back to my car. I'd found nothing concrete, nothing I could take to Bennett to prove I wasn't making things up. Just a lingering sense of being watched that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end the entire time I was there. That night, I dreamed of the creature again, but this time it wasn't chasing me through the woods. It was standing in my bedroom, those long limbs folded at impossible angles to fit in the limited space, that wide mouth grinning at me from the foot of my bed. I woke with a start, fumbling for the light switch and my gun simultaneously. The room was empty, of course, just a nightmare, but it felt so real that I checked every corner, every closet, under the bed before I could convince myself I was truly alone. Sleep didn't come again that night. I sat in my living room, gun on the coffee table, lights on, waiting for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight finally spilled through the window, I felt a relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. I returned to work the next day despite Bennett's suggestion that I take more time off. I couldn't stand being alone with my thoughts anymore. At least at the station, surrounded by the mundane problems of a small town, I could pretend everything was normal. It was Walsh who brought up the Morrison case again, dropping a thick folder on my desk as I was finishing my shift. "Medical examiner's report on Grayson," he said. "Thought you might want to see it." I eyed the folder warily. "Why would I want to see that?" Walsh shrugged. "Figured you might be curious, seeing as you found him and all. There's some weird stuff in there. M.E. couldn't figure out what kind of animal did that to him." "What do you mean, weird stuff?" I asked, opening the folder despite my better judgment. "See for yourself," Walsh said, walking away. The report was clinical and detailed, describing the injuries to Grayson's body in precise medical terminology. But between the lines was a clear sense of confusion. The wounds didn't match any known predator. The bite marks weren't consistent with bears, wolves, coyotes, or any other large carnivore. And there was something else. Traces of a substance in the wounds that the ME couldn't identify. Some kind of corrosive agent, similar to a digestive enzyme but not matching any known species. I closed the folder, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Here was proof, scientific proof, that what had killed Grayson wasn't an ordinary animal. But it still fell far short of confirming what I'd seen. A weird animal was still just an animal in the eyes of the law. "What do you make of it?" Walsh asked, returning to my desk. "I don't know," I admitted. "Like I said, it was dark. I didn't get a good look at it." Walsh studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were holding something back." "Why would I do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "That's what I've been asking myself," he replied. "What could be so bad that you'd rather have people think you emptied your gun at a shadow than tell them what you really saw?" I had no good answer for that. "I'm not holding anything back. I told you everything I know." Walsh didn't look convinced, but he dropped the subject. "Whatever you say. But if there's something dangerous out there, something we should be warning people about, that's on you." His words followed me home that night, echoing in my mind as I went through my now standard routine of checking every room, every closet, under every piece of furniture. What if the creature attacked someone else? What if another body turned up? Could I live with that on my conscience? But what was I supposed to do? Tell everyone about a monster from a nightmare? I'd be laughed out of town, maybe even lose my job. And without my badge, without my gun, I'd have no way to protect myself or anyone else if that thing came back. So I said nothing, and the days turned into weeks. The Morrison case gradually faded from local conversation, replaced by the usual small-town gossip. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when you spent every night waiting for a monster to crawl through your window. I almost convinced myself it was over. That maybe the creature had been wounded worse than I thought. That it had crawled away to die somewhere in the deep woods. That maybe, just maybe, I could start sleeping through the night again. Then the second body appeared. It was almost a month to the day after the Morrison house incident. I was on patrol, driving the back roads as I did most nights now, telling myself I was just being thorough when really I was looking for signs of the creature. The call came in just after midnight. A truck driver had spotted something on the side of the county road, about 5 miles south of town. Something that looked like a body. I was the closest unit, so I took the call, trying to ignore the dread building in my stomach. It was probably a deer, I told myself. Roadkill, nothing to worry about. But when I arrived at the coordinates, my headlights illuminated something unmistakably human lying half in the ditch, half on the asphalt. I pulled over, radioed my position, and approached with my flashlight drawn. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing hiking clothes and boots. Her backpack lay a few feet away, contents spilled across the road as if she'd been running when she was attacked. And attacked she had been. Her body bore the same horrific wounds as Grayson's, torso torn open, internal organs missing, face frozen and an expression of terror. But there was something new this time, something that made my blood run cold. Carved into her forehead, with surgical precision, was a symbol. A crude star inside a circle. I recognized her from town. Grace Miller, the new high school biology teacher who'd moved to Munden at the start of the school year. She lived in the apartment above the drugstore and often went hiking on the weekends. Everyone said she was nice, if a bit reserved. She hadn't been in town long enough to make many friends. Now she never would. I called it in, my voice steady despite the panic churning inside me. Another body, another attack. But this was different. The symbol changed things. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was deliberate. Calculated. Within 30 minutes, the scene was crawling with law enforcement. Local deputies, county sheriffs, even a couple of state troopers who happened to be in the area. Bennett arrived shortly after, his face grim as he surveyed the body. Same as Grayson? He asked quietly, pulling me aside. Worse, I replied. Look at her forehead. Bennett leaned closer, then recoiled when he saw the symbol. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I don't know, I admitted. But whatever did this, it's not an animal. At least, not just an animal. Bennett gave me a sharp look. What are you saying? I hesitated, wrestling with how much to reveal. I'm saying this is deliberate, calculated. Animals don't carve symbols into their victims, so we're looking at a person? Some kind of ritualistic murder? Maybe, I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. No human could have done what I saw that night at the Morrison house. No human could move like that, disappear like that. But a person with a trained animal? Or something else entirely? I didn't know, and not knowing terrified me more than anything. The investigation kicked into high gear after that. The FBI was called in, bringing specialists in ritual killings and serial murders. The town was placed under an unofficial curfew, with residents advised to stay indoors after dark and travel in groups during the day. I was interviewed extensively, forced to go over every detail of both discoveries. I stuck to my story. A large animal too dark to identify clearly, moving with unusual speed. I didn't mention the spider-like limbs, the too wide mouth, the intelligence in its movements. Those details stayed locked in my head, along with my growing fear that I was somehow responsible for these deaths by not speaking up sooner. For weeks, the investigation dominated life in Munden. Reporters from nearby cities descended on the town, turning our quiet streets into a circus of cameras and microphones. Theories abounded, each more sensational than the last. A satanic cult, a copycat killer inspired by some obscure horror movie, a military experiment gone wrong. I watched it all with a detached sense of disbelief. None of them came close to the truth. None of them could imagine what I had seen. Despite the increased police presence, despite the FBI agents combing the woods and questioning everyone in town, no trace of the killer was found. No unusual footprints, no DNA beyond that unidentifiable substance, nothing that could lead us to whatever was responsible, until the third body appeared. This time, it was on my property. My small house sat on the edge of town, backing up to the same woods that surrounded the Morrison place, about 2 miles away as the crow flies. I'd chosen it for the privacy, for the quiet. Now that choice seemed like a terrible mistake. I found the body when I returned home from my shift, spotting something wrong in my backyard as I pulled into the driveway. At first I thought it was vandalism, something draped over my back fence, but as I approached, flashlight in hand, the shape resolved into something unmistakably human. It was a man this time, middle-aged, dressed in hunting gear. His body was arranged in a deliberate pose, arms outstretched along the top of the fence, legs dangling down toward my yard. His chest was torn open like the others, but the killing wound wasn't what made me stumble backward in horror. His face had been removed. Not cut or torn, but peeled away with methodical precision, leaving only raw muscle and bone beneath. And carved into his exposed skull was that same symbol, a star inside a circle. But the true horror wasn't the body itself. It was what the positioning meant. This wasn't random. This was a message. For me, it knew where I lived. It knew who I was. And it wanted me to know that it knew. I called it in with numb fingers, barely able to form coherent sentences. Within minutes, my quiet property was transformed into a major crime scene, floodlights illuminating every corner of my backyard, evidence techs in white suits combing through the grass blade by blade. Bennett pulled me aside, his face grave. "You want to tell me why this one's in your backyard?" "I don't know." I lied, unable to meet his eyes. "Maybe because I found the first one? Maybe it's targeting law enforcement?" "Maybe," Bennett said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But I can't help feeling there's something you're not telling me." I remained silent, watching the techs work. What could I say? That I'd seen a monster and kept it to myself. That 3 people were dead because I was afraid of sounding crazy. The victim was identified as Robert Jennings, a hunter from 2 counties over who'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. No connection to Munden, no connection to Grace Miller or Martin Grayson. The only thing linking them was the manner of death and, now, that symbol. I didn't go back into my house that night. Or the next. I checked into the motel on the edge of town, telling myself it was just until the investigation cleared my property. But deep down, I knew I'd never feel safe in that house again. Sleep became an even more distant memory. I took to patrolling in my off hours, driving the back roads with my shotgun on the passenger seat, looking for any sign of the creature. I knew it was out there watching, waiting. For what? I couldn't say. The town changed too. Doors that had never been locked before were now double-bolted. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. The streets emptied at sunset as everyone hurried home to the relative safety of locked doors and drawn curtains. Fear hung over Munden like a fog, almost tangible in its intensity. But beneath that collective fear was something else, something directed specifically at me. Suspicion. Why had the body been left on my property? Why had I been first on the scene for all 3 discoveries? Why did I seem so unsurprised by each new horror? No one said anything outright, but I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I entered the diner, in the way people crossed the street to avoid passing me on the sidewalk. They didn't believe my story about an animal attack. They thought I knew more than I was saying, and they were right. It came to a head one evening at Donovan's General Store. I was buying coffee, trying to ignore the whispers that followed me down the aisle, when Agnes Wilson, whose family had lived in Munden since its founding, stepped directly into my path. "My grandson is afraid to go outside," she said, her voice quavering with age and anger. "He thinks there's a monster in the woods. All the children do. And I want to know what you're going to do about it." I met her gaze, seeing the fear behind the anger. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Wilson. The FBI is—" "Not them," she interrupted. "You. What are you going to do? You've seen it, haven't you? Everyone knows you have." The store had gone silent. All eyes were on me, waiting for my response. In that moment, I realized I couldn't keep the truth to myself any longer. Not if it meant more people would die. "Yes," I said quietly. "I've seen it." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Agnes's eyes widened. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "I don't know. Not exactly. But it's not an animal, not in the way we think of animals. It's something else." "A monster," someone whispered. "If you want to call it that," I replied, "but I don't think that's quite right either. It's intelligent. It leaves bodies as messages. The last one was for me." "Why you?" Agnes demanded. "Because I saw it. Because I wounded it. And I think it's been watching me ever since. The silence that followed was profound. I could see the mixture of fear and disbelief on their faces. Some looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Others looked terrified, as if naming the thing had somehow made it more real. "What are we supposed to do?" someone finally asked. "Lock your doors. Stay inside after dark. And if you see anything unusual, anything at all, call me directly, not the station. Me." I left before they could ask more questions, questions I didn't have answers to. But as I walked back to my patrol car, I felt a small measure of relief. The truth was out now, at least part of it. I wasn't carrying the burden alone anymore. That night, as I drove the back roads as had become my custom, I found myself approaching the Morrison house again. I hadn't been back since that day I'd searched it, weeks ago. Now, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name, I turned down the dirt road and made my way to the clearing. The house looked different in the moonlight, more sinister than it had in daylight. The crime scene tape was gone, the investigation long since moved on to newer, fresher horrors. I parked and got out, shotgun in hand, every sense alert for danger. The front door was still locked with the official padlock, but the back door stood ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze. I approached cautiously, sweeping my flashlight across the overgrown yard, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the endless whisper of wind through dead leaves. I pushed the door open wider, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges. The house was as I remembered it, rotten and decaying, full of debris and shadows. But something had changed. There was a new smell, stronger than the musty odor of neglect. Something chemical and sharp, mixed with that unmistakable scent of rotting meat. I moved through the house room by room, checking each corner, each shadow, with my shotgun at the ready. The study where I'd found Grayson was empty, the bloodstain on the floor now a dark, permanent mark on the rotting wood. But the hole in the wall, the hole the creature had disappeared through, was different. It had been enlarged, the edges smooth, as if carefully widened to allow easier passage, and around it, scratched into the wood with the same precision as the symbol on the victims, were dozens of tiny markings too regular to be random. I crouched down, studying them in the beam of my flashlight. They weren't English letters, nor any alphabet I recognized. But they had a deliberate structure, a pattern that suggested language rather than random scratching. As I traced one with my finger, I heard it, that wet scuttling sound that haunted my dreams. It was coming from beneath the house, directly below the hole. I scrambled backward, raising the shotgun. The sound grew louder, closer. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the hole, a long, thin limb, followed by another and another. I didn't wait to see more. I fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the confined space. Wood splintered around the hole, and there was that high-pitched keening sound I remembered from the woods. The limbs withdrew, disappearing back into the crawl space. I backed toward the door, keeping the shotgun aimed at the hole. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had become obsessed with finding answers, wanted to follow, to see what was hiding beneath the house. Before I could decide, the floor beneath my feet groaned and then gave way with a sickening crack. I plunged downward, landing hard on packed earth some 6 feet below. The fall knocked the wind out of me and sent the shotgun skittering away into the darkness. I was in some kind of root cellar or old storage space beneath the house. The air was thick with that chemical smell, so strong now that it made my eyes water. I fumbled for my flashlight, which had fallen nearby, and swept its beam around the space. What I saw made my heart stop. The walls of the cellar were covered in those same markings I'd seen around the hole. Hundreds of them, carved into every available surface. But it was what hung from the ceiling that turned my blood to ice. Bones. Human bones, stripped clean and arranged in intricate patterns, suspended from the beams by what looked like dried sinew. And among them, still recognizable, were 3 skulls. Grayson's, Grace Miller's, and Robert Jennings's. Each one marked with that same symbol, a star inside a circle. This wasn't just a lair, it was a shrine, a trophy room, and I wasn't alone in it. From the shadows at the far end of the cellar came that wet scuttling sound, louder than I'd ever heard it before. I whipped the flashlight around, and there it was, the creature, emerging from a tunnel I hadn't noticed before. It looked different now. Larger, its limbs longer and more segmented. The patches of fur had fallen away in places, revealing that sickly white skin beneath, and its face, that horrible, split-wide face, had changed too. The empty eye sockets were now filled with clusters of smaller eyes, glistening black and multifaceted. Like an insect, it rose up on those hind legs, unfolding to its full height until its head nearly touched the ceiling beams. In one of its too many hands, it held something that glinted in the flashlight beam. A blade, long and curved, made from what looked like a piece of scrap metal, honed to razor sharpness. I scrambled backward, searching desperately for the shotgun or any weapon at all. My hand closed around a piece of broken wood, a floor joist from where I'd fallen through. Better than nothing. The creature cocked its head, studying me with those clusters of eyes. Then, to my utter horror, it spoke. The sound wasn't human, more like a series of clicks and hisses modulated into something approximating speech. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all, but the cadence was unmistakably language. It took a step toward me, still making those sounds. Another step. The blade raised slightly. I lashed out with the piece of wood, more in desperation than with any hope of causing harm. To my surprise, the creature recoiled, those clusters of eyes blinking rapidly in what might have been surprise. It tried again, those clicking sounds more insistent now. When I didn't respond, it scraped the blade against the wall, carving another symbol, this one simpler, just a single straight line with a circle at one end. Was it trying to communicate? The thought was almost more terrifying than the idea of it simply attacking, because communication meant intelligence, it meant purpose, it meant this wasn't just some predator following instinct. This was something that thought, that planned, that had carved symbols into its victims for a reason. The creature gestured with the blade, pointing first to the symbol it had carved, then to me. It repeated the gesture, more emphatically this time. I shook my head, not understanding. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice hoarse with fear. It made that high-pitched keening sound again, but softer now, almost like a sigh. Then, with movements so fast I could barely track them, it lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. I swung the piece of wood wildly, connecting with one of those spindly limbs with enough force to snap the improvised weapon in half. The creature hissed, recoiling again, dark fluid dripping from where I'd struck it. It backed away, those clusters of eyes never leaving me, making those clicking sounds again, but faster now, more agitated. It retreated to the tunnel entrance, still watching me, still holding the blade. For a moment we stared at each other, human and something not human, separated by more than just the few feet of earthen floor between us. Then, with one final, prolonged hiss, it disappeared into the tunnel, taking the blade with it. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I found my shotgun, used the remains of the floor joists to climb back up to the main house, and ran to my car as if all the demons of hell were chasing me. As I drove away, faster than was safe on that rutted dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The Morrison house stood silhouetted against the night sky, dark and abandoned, but in one of the upstairs windows I saw movement, a thin, elongated shape watching my departure. I didn't go back to town, not that night. I drove and drove, putting as much distance between myself and Munden as possible. By dawn, I was 3 counties away, sitting in a diner, nursing a cup of coffee with shaking hands, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The creature wasn't just real, it was intelligent. It had a language, a written script. It had tried to communicate with me, and that was the most terrifying realization of all, because it meant that the killings weren't random acts of predation, they were deliberate. Messages, perhaps, or rituals, or something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I thought about going to the FBI, telling them everything. But what evidence did I have? What could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman? They'd already dismissed the idea of a serial killer with an animal, which was closer to the truth than they knew. No, this was my burden. I'd seen it first. I'd wounded it. And now, for whatever reason, it had chosen me for something. Communication. Combat. I didn't know, but I did know one thing, with a certainty that settled in my bones like ice. I would have to face it again. And next time, one of us wouldn't walk away. As I sat there, watching the sun rise over unfamiliar fields, I wondered if anyone would believe my story. If anyone could comprehend the horror that was hiding in the shadows of a small Kansas town. If anyone would understand why I was so afraid. But most of all, I wondered what that creature wanted. What it was trying to tell me with its symbols and its shrine of bones. What it thought I represented. And as I contemplated these questions, a chill ran down my spine. Because in the reflection of the diner window, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind me. Something long and thin and wrong-angled, watching from the edge of the parking lot. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows and the growing light of dawn. Nothing I could see anyway. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., jolting me from the thin sleep I'd managed in the ranger station. 5 years working search and rescue in Kiana National Forest, and I still wasn't used to these pre-dawn emergency calls. The voice on the other end was strained, almost panicked. "This is dispatch. We've got a missing persons report for a group of 6 hikers in Sector 7. Last known position was Mirror Lake campsite. They were supposed to check in yesterday evening but never made contact." I rubbed my eyes and reached for my boots. Sector 7 was deep wilderness, 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot or helicopter. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense old-growth forest, steep ravines, and maze-like game trails that could confuse even experienced hikers. Park rangers regularly encountered hikers who'd wandered off the path or slipped down cliffs and couldn't find their way back. Copy that. Any additional details on the missing group? International hiking party. 6 adults, ages 23 to 31. Canadian citizen reported them missing. Manus, a Jamie Chen from Vancouver, says they were on a week-long wilderness photography expedition. The group includes hikers from Australia, Britain, India, and the Philippines. They're experienced, but the weather's been unpredictable in that area. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed my emergency pack. The morning air outside was crisp, carrying the damp scent of Douglas fir and moss. In the distance, the forest canopy stretched endlessly, broken only by the pale reflection of Mirror Lake nestled between 2 ridges. "I'll head out within the hour. Send me their planned route and emergency contact information." 20 minutes later, I was loading my backpack into the ATV. The planned route showed they'd entered the forest 3 days ago at the Whispering Creek trailhead, planning to camp at designated sites before reaching Mirror Lake on day 2. From there, they'd intended to explore the remote Crying Falls area, a spot few tourists ever reached due to its difficult access. The drive to the trailhead took 90 minutes on winding mountain roads. As I parked at the empty lot, I noticed their vehicles, a rented SUV with British Columbia plates and camping gear scattered in the back. The fact that experienced hikers would leave gear behind was immediately concerning. A thermos of coffee sat half empty on the dashboard, and a camera bag lay open on the passenger seat. I shouldered my pack and started up the trail. The forest here was cathedral quiet, with towering cedars and hemlocks creating a green canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk. The woods in this area were so dense that trees blocked out the sun almost completely. My boots crunched on the carpet of fallen needles as I made good time toward their first planned campsite. 3 hours in, I found their first camp. The site was clean, almost too clean. No trash, no forgotten items, no signs of distress. The fire pit had been properly extinguished and covered. Everything suggested an orderly departure, yet something felt off. The ground around the tent sites was more disturbed than it should have been, with unusual footprints mixed in with the boot treads I expected. I photographed the impressions and continued toward Mirror Lake. The trail grew steeper, winding through stands of ancient trees whose trunks were wider than cars. Strange footprints and a feeling of being watched were common elements in ranger encounters. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and call out, listening for any response. The silence that answered was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, nothing. By early afternoon, I reached the area above Mirror Lake. The campsite sat on a small bluff overlooking the water, surrounded by granite outcroppings and dense undergrowth. This time, clear signs of disturbance were evident. One tent was missing entirely. Another lay partially collapsed, its rain fly torn. Personal items were scattered across the site. A water bottle here, a hiking boot there, a journal with pages fluttering in the breeze. I called out again, my voice echoing across the lake. "Hello, search and rescue. Can anyone hear me?" The echo died away, leaving only the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shore. I began cataloging what I found. 5 backpacks remained, but the 6th was gone. A camp stove sat assembled but unused. Most disturbing were the deep gouges in several trees around the perimeter of the campsite, fresh scratches that looked like claw marks, but far too high and too large for any known bear in the area. As I documented the scene, I noticed something else. The logbook at remote campsites often contains strange entries detailing eerie encounters with shadows and unsettling footprints. The camp's visitor log lay open, waterlogged but readable. The last entry was dated 2 days ago in shaky handwriting. Day 2, something's wrong here. Marcus heard voices in the forest all night. But when we called back, they stopped. Priya found those huge tracks near the water, going to pack up early and head to higher ground. If anyone finds this and we're not here, we went toward the falls. Myas, R. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had scrawled, "It's following us." My radio buzzed with static, but no clear transmission came through. The mountains here were notorious for poor signal, and I was now 45 miles from the nearest repeater. I was on my own until I could reach higher ground or return to an area with better coverage. I studied my topographic map. The route to Crying Falls involved crossing 2 ridges and descending into a valley that few rangers patrolled. It was wild country, the kind of place where people could disappear without a trace. But if 6 experienced hikers had headed that way in distress, I had to follow. I packed what supplies I could carry from their abandoned camp and started up the rocky trail toward the first ridge. The path was barely visible, marked only by occasional cairns and blazes carved into tree bark. As I climbed, the forest grew even more oppressive. The trees here were older, massive specimens that had stood for centuries. Their twisted branches formed a canopy so dense that afternoon light struggled to reach the forest floor. An hour into the climb, I found the first real sign that I was on the right track. A bright yellow stuff sack hung from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, too high for someone to have placed it there intentionally. The fabric was torn and dark stains marked one corner. I photographed it and continued climbing, fighting the growing sensation that something was very wrong in these woods. Near the ridgeline, I discovered what looked like a temporary shelter, branches and pine boughs arranged against a large boulder. Someone had spent time here recently. The ground was compressed, and I found granola bar wrappers and an empty water bottle. But why build a shelter when they had tents? And why here, exposed on the ridge instead of in the protected valley below? As evening approached, I faced a critical decision. Protocol dictated that I should return to the ranger station and organize a full search party. But these people had been missing for at least 2 days, and every hour increased the danger they faced from exposure, injury, or worse. The weather report called for storms overnight, and if they were injured or lost, they might not survive another night in the wilderness. I made camp on the ridge, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. As I set up my tent, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I'd turned to look, nothing was there. Bigfoot investigators often described evidence of something rubbing against trees in areas where sightings occurred. Several large trees near my camp showed fresh bark damage, and the musky smell that clung to them was unlike anything I'd encountered in 5 years of forest work. As darkness fell, I settled into my sleeping bag with my radio, trying repeatedly to raise dispatch. Static filled the airwaves, occasionally broken by fragments of distant conversations. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in a wilderness that felt increasingly hostile. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a loud pop, like a tree's last leg snapping before it falls. I sat up in my tent, listening intently. Minutes passed in absolute silence, then the forest's normal night sounds gradually returned. But something had changed. The air felt charged, as if a thunderstorm was approaching, though the sky was clear. I dozed fitfully until dawn, waking to find large footprints circling my campsite, impressions in the soft earth that were unmistakably human-like but far too big. Each print was at least 18 inches long and showed clear toe marks. Whatever had made them had stood directly outside my tent during the night, close enough that I should have heard breathing, but I'd heard nothing at all. As I broke camp and prepared to continue toward Crying Falls, one thought kept circling through my mind. I wasn't just tracking 6 missing hikers anymore. Something else was out here in Kiana Forest, and it knew I was coming. The descent toward Crying Falls began with a steep switchback trail that hugged the mountainside. Morning mist clung to the valleys below, creating an ethereal landscape that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now, every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me pause and listen. I'd been hiking for 2 hours when I found the first piece of concrete evidence that the missing group had come this way. A red bandana hung from a thorny vine at eye level, positioned deliberately where it couldn't be missed. The fabric was torn and muddy, but I recognized it from the gear list Jamie Chen had provided to dispatch. It belonged to Marcus, the Australian photographer in the group. 30 yards further down the trail, I discovered something more disturbing. A backpack lay partially hidden under a fallen log, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Maps, energy bars, and camping gear were strewn about as if the pack had been ripped open by force. Most of the food was gone, but I found a passport belonging to Anika Sharma from Mumbai. Her photo showed a smiling young woman with kind eyes. Now she was somewhere in this wilderness, possibly injured, certainly in danger. The trail leveled out as I entered the valley proper. Here ancient cedars created a green cathedral, their massive trunks rising like pillars toward a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. The forest was so dense that trees blocked out the sun almost completely. The silence was unnatural. No bird songs, no chittering of squirrels, none of the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem. I followed a faint game trail that paralleled a rushing creek. The sound of water was the only noise breaking the oppressive quiet. As I rounded a bend, I spotted something that made me freeze in place. About 50 yards ahead, a figure sat motionless against a large boulder. "Hello," I called out. "Are you injured?" "I'm with search and rescue." No response. No movement. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. As I got closer, relief flooded through me. It was a person, one of the missing hikers. But my relief quickly turned to concern as I realized something was very wrong. The figure was Raj Patel, according to his wallet, which lay open beside him. The young man from London sat with his back against the boulder, eyes wide open and staring into the forest. He was breathing, but shallowly, and didn't respond when I knelt beside him and called his name. "Raj, can you hear me? I'm here to help you." His lips moved slightly, forming silent words. I leaned closer and heard him whisper the same phrase over and over. "It's not supposed to be there. It's not supposed to be there." I checked his pulse, rapid but steady. No obvious injuries, no signs of hypothermia or dehydration. But he was clearly in severe shock, completely unresponsive to my attempts at communication. The rescued hiker was found missing shoes and pack and was clearly in shock, asking about that big man with black eyes following them. His shoes were missing and his feet were cut and bleeding from walking barefoot through the forest. I wrapped him in my emergency blanket and tried to get him to drink water, but he just continued staring into the trees and whispering that same phrase. Whatever had happened to him, whatever he'd seen, had left him completely traumatized. A thorough search of the area revealed more disturbing evidence. Deep gouges scarred the bark of several trees, far too high for any known animal in the region. The scratches formed deliberate patterns, almost like territorial markings. Fresh scat near the creek was unlike anything in my field guides, too large for bear, wrong consistency for elk, and containing what looked like fragments of fabric. Most unsettling were the structures I found deeper in the valley. Someone, or something, had constructed crude shelters from fallen branches and moss. But the architecture was wrong, alien somehow. The openings faced inward toward a central area where the ground was packed down as if from heavy footfalls. Scattered around this space were personal items from the missing hikers: a water bottle, a torn piece of clothing, a camping knife with its blade snapped in half. As I documented everything with my camera, I became aware of an odor that grew stronger the longer I remained in the area. It was a musky animal smell mixed with something else, something that reminded me of wet concrete and decay. Bigfoot encounters often involved a distinctive musky smell that witnesses found difficult to describe. The sound of snapping branches made me look up sharply. About 100 yards away, something large moved through the trees. I caught only a glimpse, a dark shape that seemed too tall and too broad to be human, yet moved upright like a person. When I called out, the movement stopped instantly, and the forest returned to its unnatural silence. I made the difficult decision to continue deeper into the valley rather than turning back with Raj. 5 people were still missing, and his condition, while concerning, wasn't immediately life-threatening. I fashioned a more substantial shelter for him using my emergency tarp and left most of my food and water within easy reach. "I'll be back," I promised, though he showed no sign of hearing me. "I'm going to find your friends." The trail deeper into the valley was barely visible, marked only by broken vegetation and the occasional scuff mark on a tree trunk. As I followed it, I began to notice that I wasn't alone. Something was paralleling my route, staying just out of sight but making enough noise to let me know it was there. Hikers often reported the sense of being followed or watched in deep wilderness areas. Every 100 yards or so, I'd stop and listen. The sounds would stop too, creating an eerie game of follow the leader through the darkening forest. When I moved, it moved. When I paused, it paused. But I never got a clear look at whatever was tracking me. The valley narrowed as I approached Crying Falls, the creek cutting through steep granite walls. The trail became treacherous, requiring careful navigation around loose rocks and slippery moss. It was here that I found the second hiker. Carmen Rodriguez from the Philippines sat on a rocky ledge about 20 feet above the creek, her knees pulled up to her chest, rocking slowly back and forth. Unlike Raj, she was aware of my presence and even spoke to me, but her words made little sense. "They took Marcus," she said when I climbed up to reach her. Right out of his sleeping bag, we could hear him calling for help, but his voice kept getting farther away. "Who took him?" "Carmen, I need you to focus. Who took Marcus?" She looked at me with haunted eyes. "The tall ones. They move like people, but they're not people. They smell like old earth and wet fur. One of them was watching us for 2 days before they finally came into camp." I helped her down from the ledge and gave her water and food. She was in better shape than Raj, physically at least, but clearly traumatized by whatever had happened. As she ate, she continued talking in fragmented sentences. "Priya ran when they took Marcus. Just ran straight into the woods screaming. We haven't seen her since yesterday morning. And James tried to fight them. He had his camera out, was trying to take pictures. They didn't like that. They really didn't like that." "Where are James and Anika now?" Carmen pointed deeper into the valley, toward the sound of falling water. "They dragged them toward the falls. James was hurt bad. His arm was bent the wrong way. But he was still alive when they took him." The afternoon was growing late, and I faced another difficult choice. I could try to get Carmen back to where I'd left Raj and set up a defensive position for the night, or I could continue toward the falls while there was still daylight. Every instinct told me that traveling through this valley after dark would be extremely dangerous, but 3 people were still missing, and at least 2 of them were injured. "Carmen, I need you to be brave. Can you make it back up the valley to where I left your friend Raj? There's shelter there, and supplies." She shook her head frantically. "I can't go back through the trees. They're watching. They're always watching now." I looked around at the granite walls of the narrow canyon. The sound of crying falls was much louder here, drowning out other noises. If something did attack, we'd have limited escape routes. But Carmen was right about one thing. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming. Multiple times I caught glimpses of movement on the canyon rim high above us. Dark shapes that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. As we prepared to move toward the falls, Carmen grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You need to understand something," she said urgently. "They're not animals. They think, they plan, and they're angry about something. Really, really angry." The sound of falling water grew louder as we worked our way along the increasingly treacherous creek bed. Behind us, I could have sworn I heard the sound of multiple footsteps on loose rock, following at a distance. Whatever had taken Marcus and the others was still out there, and it was watching our every move. The approach to Crying Falls took us through a narrow gorge where granite walls rose nearly vertical on both sides. The creek cascaded down through a series of pools, each one deeper and darker than the last. This was the most remote part of Kahana Forest, a place where few rangers ventured and even fewer hikers ever reached. Carmen moved slowly beside me, favoring her left ankle and glancing constantly at the canyon walls above us. The sound of falling water masked other noises, which made me nervous. If something was following us, and I was certain something was, we wouldn't hear it approaching until it was too late. "There," Carmen whispered, pointing ahead to where the canyon opened into a small amphitheater. "That's where they took James and Anika." The space before us was like a natural cathedral. Crying Falls plunged 60 feet from the canyon rim into a deep pool surrounded by massive boulders. Mist from the falling water created an otherworldly atmosphere, and shafts of late afternoon sunlight pierced the spray to create shifting rainbows. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it felt like a trap. I approached the pool cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of the missing hikers. The rocky ground around the falls was littered with debris, broken branches, stones that had been deliberately stacked in odd patterns, and something that made my stomach clench. Pieces of torn clothing scattered like confetti across the rocks. "James!" I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Anika, this is search and rescue." My shouts were answered by something that raised every hair on my body. From somewhere high above the falls came a sound unlike anything I'd heard in 5 years of forest work. It was a shrill wail that echoed through the canyon, not quite human, not quite animal, but expressing what could only be described as rage. Carmen whimpered and pressed herself against the nearest boulder. "That's the sound they made when they took Marcus. Oh God, they're still here." The wailing stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of falling water. But the silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It felt expectant, as if something was waiting for us to make the next move. I found more evidence of the missing hikers near the base of the falls. A camera lay smashed against the rocks, its lens shattered and memory card missing. Nearby, a hiking boot sat upright on a flat stone, positioned so deliberately that it could only have been placed there intentionally. Inside the boot was a piece of paper, waterlogged but still readable. The handwriting was James's, according to Carmen. The message was brief but chilling. They took our pictures. They don't want proof. If you find this, tell our families we love them. Don't try to follow us up the falls. I looked up at the cascade of water, following its path to where it disappeared over the canyon rim. The rock face was steep but climbable, with plenty of handholds carved by centuries of water flow. If James and Anika had been taken up there, I had to follow. Carmen, I need you to stay here and hide behind these boulders. Whatever happens, don't come looking for me. If I'm not back by morning, follow the creek downstream until you reach the main trail. She grabbed my sleeve. You can't go up there. You saw what happened to the others. Please, let's just get out of here and come back with more people. I understood her fear, but I couldn't abandon 3 people who might still be alive. Professional obligation aside, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help them. The climb up the rock face beside the falls was treacherous. The stone was slick with spray, and the handholds were often hidden by moss and lichen. Halfway up, I discovered something that nearly made me lose my grip. Deep gouges in the granite showed where something with enormous claws had climbed this same route. The scratches were fresh, and some still showed traces of dark material that looked like dried blood. As I neared the top of the falls, I could smell that musky odor again, much stronger now. It was mixed with something else, the metallic scent of blood and a sickly sweet smell that reminded me of decay. My hands shook as I pulled myself over the rim and onto a flat area surrounded by dense forest. The scene that greeted me was something out of a nightmare. A crude camp had been constructed in a clearing about 50 yards from the falls. But this wasn't made by humans. Large branches had been woven together to form dome-like structures, each one just big enough for a person to huddle inside. The construction was sophisticated yet alien, using techniques I'd never seen in any survival manual. James Blackwood sat propped against a tree on the far side of the clearing, his left arm clearly broken and hanging at an unnatural angle. He was conscious but barely responsive, staring at me with glassy eyes that spoke of severe trauma and possibly head injury. "James, can you hear me? I'm here to get you out." He blinked slowly and whispered something I couldn't quite catch. I moved closer and heard him repeat, "Don't move fast. They don't like fast movements." That's when I saw Anika. She was inside one of the branch structures, curled into a fetal position but breathing. She appeared unconscious but uninjured. Near her lay Marcus, the Australian photographer, still alive but in worse shape than James. His legs were clearly broken, and dark bruises covered his exposed skin. All 3 were alive, but barely. They'd been kept here like specimens, or prisoners. I was checking James's pulse when I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Not the careful, measured steps of a human, but something else. Something that moved on 2 legs, but with a gait that was subtly wrong. The woman kept looking behind them and asking about that big man with black eyes who was following them. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line where I couldn't see clearly. But I could feel eyes watching me, evaluating me, deciding what to do about the intruder in their domain. "I know you're there," I said aloud, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to take these people to safety." The response was immediate and terrifying. The witness describes encountering massive Bigfoot creatures, one standing on a porch while another stood nearby, making threatening sounds. 3 shapes emerged from the forest, moving upright but with an inhuman grace. They were massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in dark hair. Their faces were almost human, but wrong in subtle ways, with eyes that held an intelligence that was both alien and unmistakably aware. The largest of the 3 stepped forward, and I got my first clear look at what the locals sometimes called by whispered names. Creatures that science said didn't exist, but that every ranger in the deep wilderness had heard stories about. Its face showed a mixture of curiosity and barely controlled aggression. When it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that were designed for tearing meat. I forced myself to remain still, remembering James's warning about sudden movements. The creature examined me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it made a sound, a low rumble that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. The other 2 creatures responded with similar vocalizations, and I realized I was witnessing some form of communication. The largest creature gestured toward the injured hikers with one massive hand, then back at me. The message was clear. These people belonged to them now. I was trespassing. Fighting was out of the question. Even if I'd been armed with something more substantial than bear spray, taking on 3 creatures of this size and strength would have been suicide. Instead, I did something that went against every instinct screaming in my head. I sat down, slowly, carefully. I lowered myself to the ground and assumed a non-threatening posture. I kept my hands visible and my movements deliberate and calm. The creatures watched every motion, but the tension in the air decreased slightly. "I understand this is your territory," I said quietly, not sure if they could understand my words, but hoping they could at least interpret my tone. "But these people are injured. They'll die if they don't get medical help." The largest creature tilted its head at the sound of my voice, a disturbingly human gesture. It looked at the three injured hikers, then back at me, and I could almost see it thinking, whatever these beings were, they possessed a level of intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant sound of the falls. Then, incredibly, the largest creature stepped back and gestured toward the injured hikers. It was giving me permission to approach them, moving slowly. I went to Marcus first. His condition was critical, both legs broken, possible internal injuries, and signs of severe dehydration. James was in better shape but needed immediate medical attention for his arm and possible concussion. Anika was the most responsive, conscious but clearly traumatized. "What do they want?" she whispered when I knelt beside her. "I don't know," I admitted. "But they're letting me help you. That's something." As I worked to stabilize the injured hikers for transport, I became aware that the creatures were watching my every move with intense interest. They seemed particularly fascinated by my first aid kit and the way I splinted Marcus's legs. When I used my radio to try reaching dispatch, still no signal, the largest creature stepped closer, its head tilted as it studied the device. The realization hit me then. These beings had been observing humans for a long time, learning about us, studying our behavior and technology. The camera James had been using when he was taken, they had understood its significance. They knew it could provide proof of their existence, and they'd destroyed it deliberately. But they'd kept the hikers alive. Why? As evening approached and the light began to fade, I faced the most difficult decision of my career. Moving three seriously injured people down the rocky face beside the falls, in the dark, was extremely dangerous. But staying here overnight with these creatures was equally risky. The largest being seemed to sense my dilemma. It approached slowly and gestured toward a path I hadn't noticed before, a route that led away from the falls through the forest. It was showing me another way down, an easier path that wouldn't require the dangerous climb. Whatever these creatures were, they understood that the hikers needed help, and incredibly, they were going to let me take them. The path the creature had shown me led through dense forest in a direction I hadn't expected. Instead of descending directly toward the valley floor, it followed the contours of the mountainside, gradually spiraling downward through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without a guide. In the fading light, I could see that this wasn't a game trail. It was something else entirely. A route that had been deliberately constructed and maintained. Moving three severely injured people along any trail would have been challenging under the best circumstances. Marcus was barely conscious, his broken legs making every step agony despite the makeshift splints I'd fashioned. James could walk but needed constant support, his broken arm and possible head injury making him unsteady and confused. Anika was in the best shape physically, but the psychological trauma had left her jumping at every sound and frequently looking over her shoulder. What made the situation truly surreal was our escort. The three creatures, I'd started thinking of them as the family, based on their apparent relationships, moved through the forest around us like silent guardians. I never saw them directly except when they chose to be visible, but I always knew they were there. Branches would move without wind, shadows would shift in ways that defied the available light, and occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of dark fur or glowing eyes in my peripheral vision. They were protecting us. This became clear about an hour into our descent when we encountered what could have been a fatal obstacle. The trail crossed a steep ravine via a fallen log that would have been treacherous for healthy hikers, let alone injured ones. As I was trying to figure out how to get everyone across safely, I heard the sound of cracking wood. Two massive trees on opposite sides of the ravine fell simultaneously, their trunks landing perfectly parallel to create a stable bridge. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. When I looked around for our mysterious helpers, I caught sight of the largest creature watching from a distance, its expression unreadable. "They're helping us," Anika whispered in amazement. "Why are they helping us?" I had no answer for that. Everything I thought I knew about these beings had been turned upside down in the last few hours. They were intelligent, capable of complex planning, and apparently possessed something resembling compassion, or at least pragmatic cooperation. As we carefully crossed their improvised bridge, I noticed something else. The forest around us was changing. The unnatural silence that had characterized the valley was giving way to normal woodland sounds, night birds calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote. It was as if the presence of the creatures had some effect on the local ecosystem, and their decision to escort us was somehow signaling that we were under protection. "How much farther?" James asked, his words slurred from pain and exhaustion. I checked my GPS, though the device had been unreliable since entering the deep forest. "We're making good progress. Maybe 2 more hours to reach the area where I left Raj and Carmen," but even as I said it, I wondered what we'd find when we got there. Carmen had been traumatized and potentially in shock when I left her. Raj had been completely unresponsive. If their conditions had deteriorated, or if other dangers had found them, I might be leading 3 injured people toward more problems rather than safety. The trail leveled out as we entered a valley I didn't recognize from my topographic maps. Ancient trees formed a canopy so dense that it was impossible to see the stars, and the only light came from my headlamp and the pale phosphorescence of certain fungi growing on fallen logs. The air here was different too, thick and humid, carrying scents that seemed almost tropical despite our elevation. Marcus collapsed about halfway through the valley, his makeshift splints failing and his strength finally giving out completely. As I knelt beside him, checking his pulse and trying to decide whether to attempt CPR, I became aware that we were no longer alone on the trail. The family had revealed themselves, stepping out of the forest in formation. But they weren't alone. At least 6 more creatures emerged from the darkness, ranging in size from what might have been juveniles to another massive adult that rivaled the largest of our original escort. I was looking at an entire community of beings that science insisted didn't exist. The largest newcomer approached Marcus and knelt beside him, studying his injuries with obvious intelligence. When it looked up at me, I saw something in its eyes that I recognized: concern. This creature understood that Marcus was dying. What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The creature gently lifted Marcus in its arms, cradling the injured man like a child. Marcus should have screamed in pain from the movement, but instead he seemed to relax, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular. The creature was somehow calming him, reducing his trauma response in a way that seemed almost supernatural. "Jesus," James whispered, his voice filled with awe rather than fear. The entire group of creatures began moving again, with the one carrying Marcus taking the lead. Our pace increased significantly now that we didn't have to worry about Marcus walking, and I realized that these beings knew exactly where they were taking us. This wasn't random wandering, it was a purposeful journey to a specific destination. 20 minutes later, I understood where we were going. The forest opened into a clearing that shouldn't have existed according to my maps. At its center sat a cabin that looked like it had been built decades ago but was clearly still maintained. Warm light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was the most beautiful sight I'd seen in days, but also the most confusing. "There's no cabin marked on any map of this area," I muttered, checking my GPS again. The creature carrying Marcus approached the cabin's front door and waited. After a moment, the door opened, and I got another shock. An elderly man stepped out, completely unsurprised to see a massive cryptid holding an injured hiker on his front porch. "Bring him inside," the man said calmly. "I've got a bed prepared." I stared at the stranger in disbelief. He was perhaps 70 years old, with weathered skin and long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. His clothes were practical wilderness gear, but well-made and expensive. Most surprising was his complete lack of fear in the presence of the creatures. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Dr. Samuel Crow Feather," he replied, stepping aside to let the creature carry Marcus into the cabin. "I'm a retired physician and I've been expecting you." The interior of the cabin was like stepping into another world. Medical equipment that clearly didn't belong in a remote wilderness setting lined one wall. Books on cryptozoology, indigenous folklore, and natural history filled floor-to-ceiling shelves. But most striking were the photographs covering every available wall space, dozens of pictures showing the creatures in their natural habitat, going about their daily lives like any other family group. "You know about them," I said as Dr. Crowfeather examined Marcus's injuries. "Know about them?" He smiled as he prepared an IV line. "I've been their neighbor for 30 years. They brought you here because they trust me to help injured humans. It's happened before." As he worked to stabilize Marcus, I helped James and Anika into chairs near the fireplace. Both were exhausted and still in shock, but the warmth and safety of the cabin was already helping them relax. Outside, I could see the creatures gathered around the clearing, maintaining what appeared to be a protective perimeter. "This doesn't make sense," I said to Dr. Crowfeather. "Why aren't you on any maps? How did you get medical equipment out here? And why are you living with creatures that everyone says don't exist? He looked up from his patient with eyes that held deep sadness. Because 30 years ago, I made a mistake that cost people their lives. I led an expedition into these mountains looking for exactly what you found. But we weren't as respectful as we should have been. We wanted to capture one of them, to bring proof back to the scientific community. He paused in his work, his hands still for a moment. They defended themselves. 3 people died, including my research partner and best friend. I was the only survivor, and I was badly injured. The creatures could have let me die, but instead they brought me here, to this cabin that belonged to an old hermit who'd passed away that winter. They nursed me back to health. And you stayed, Anika said softly. I stayed. I became their friend, their unofficial physician when needed, and their guardian in the human world. I make sure no one finds this place who shouldn't, and I provide medical care when accidents happen. It's the least I can do to make up for the harm I caused. Through the cabin's windows I could see more creatures emerging from the forest. Some were clearly curious about the unusual activity, while others seemed to be bringing food and supplies. I was witnessing a level of social organization and community cooperation that would revolutionize our understanding of primate behavior. Where are Raj and Carmen? I asked, suddenly remembering the 2 hikers I'd left in the valley. Dr. Crowfeather smiled. Safe. They were brought here yesterday evening. Raj is sleeping in the back room. He'll be fine once the shock wears off. Carmen is helping me organize supplies. She's tougher than she looks. As if summoned by her name, Carmen appeared from the cabin's rear carrying medical supplies. She looked better than when I'd last seen her, rested, clean, and no longer showing signs of trauma. You made it, she said, relief evident in her voice. I was so worried when you didn't come back with the others. The creatures brought them here, I explained. The same ones that took you from your campsite. They're not what we thought they were. Carmen nodded. Dr. Crowfeather explained everything. They weren't kidnapping us, they were rescuing us. Something else was hunting in the forest, something that drove them to take us to safety. A chill ran down my spine. Something else? Dr. Crowfeather looked up from his patient, his expression grave. You didn't think these were the only unknown species in these mountains, did you? The family, that's what I call them. They're the guardians of this ecosystem, but they're not the apex predators. There's something else, something much more dangerous that moved into their territory about a week ago. Outside, a sound echoed through the forest that made every creature in the clearing freeze. It was a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more primal, and filled with a hunger that seemed to resonate in my bones. That's what they were protecting you from, Dr. Crowfeather said quietly. And now it's found us. The howl that echoed through the forest around Dr. Crowfeather's cabin was answered by similar calls from at least 3 different directions. Whatever was out there, we were surrounded. Through the cabin's windows, I watched the family's response with fascination and growing dread. The creatures that had seemed so formidable just hours earlier now appeared genuinely frightened. The largest of them, the one I thought of as the patriarch, approached the cabin and made a series of complex vocalizations that Dr. Crowfeather seemed to understand. The old man nodded grimly and began moving around the cabin, checking locks and securing what appeared to be reinforced shutters over the windows. What's happening? James asked, his voice tight with renewed fear. The hunger has found us, Dr. Crowfeather replied, his weathered hands moving efficiently to prepare the cabin for siege. It's what drove the family to take you from your campsite in the first place. They could smell it approaching their territory. The hunger? I helped him bar the front door. What is that? Dr. Crowfeather paused in his preparations. And in the firelight, his face looked older than his years. Something that shouldn't exist even in a forest full of impossible things. I've only seen it twice in 30 years, and both times it was devastating. Marcus was unconscious but stable on the medical cot Dr. Crowfeather had prepared. His broken legs were properly splinted now, and an IV drip was addressing his dehydration. But even unconscious, he seemed to sense the tension in the air, moaning softly and moving restlessly. Outside, the sounds grew closer, not just howls now, but the crack of breaking trees and a sound like rocks grinding against each other. The family had formed a defensive circle around the cabin, but I could see them backing closer to the building. Whatever they were facing was pushing them back. How many of them are there? Carmen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Crowfeather was checking what appeared to be a rifle that looked military in origin. I don't know, the hunger doesn't follow normal pack behavior. Sometimes it's alone, sometimes it travels in groups. But it's always wrong. A tremendous crash shook the cabin as something massive struck the outer wall. Through a gap in the shutters, I caught a glimpse of what had hit us, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was something that moved like a person but was clearly not human, with limbs that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. The creature, if it could be called that, was perhaps 9 feet tall and covered in what looked like matted fur that moved independently of its body. But the most disturbing aspect was its face. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for human, but up close the proportions were completely wrong. The mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that belonged in the jaw of a shark rather than a mammal. And the eyes held an intelligence that was purely malevolent. "Don't look directly at it," Dr. Crowfeather warned, but it was too late. The thing outside had noticed my observation and pressed its face against the gap in the shutters. When our eyes met, I felt something probe the edges of my mind, a presence that was both alien and hungry for something more than just flesh. I stumbled backward, my head spinning with images that weren't my own. Flashes of the creature stalking through the forest, tracking our group for days before the family intervened. Memories of other hikers, other victims who hadn't been so fortunate. And underneath it all, a constant gnawing hunger that could never be satisfied. "It's in my head," I gasped, pressing my palms against my temples. Dr. Crowfeather grabbed my shoulders and forced me to look at him. "Fight it. Don't let it see your memories. Think about something else. Anything else." But it was too late. Through the psychic connection, the creature had seen what it was looking for. The route back to civilization, the ranger station, the nearby town full of unsuspecting people. It knew I was a park ranger, knew I had responsibilities beyond these mountains, and it was using that knowledge to plan its next feeding. The attack on the cabin intensified. Multiple creatures now. I could hear at least 4 distinct howls circling the building. The family was fighting back, their own vocalizations rising to challenge the intruders, but their calls held a note of desperation that suggested they were losing. "We need to get out of here," I said, forcing myself to think clearly despite the lingering mental intrusion. "If we stay, we're trapped. And if they break through, where can we go?" Anika asked. "Marcus can't be moved again so soon." Dr. Crowfeather was already moving, gathering supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for this scenario. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin. It connects to a natural cave system that leads back toward the main valley. The family showed it to me years ago as an emergency escape route." A tremendous roar shook the cabin, followed by the sound of splintering wood. One of the shutters had been torn away and massive claws probed through the broken window. James scrambled backward as needle-sharp talons swept the air where he'd been standing. "Now would be good," Carmen said, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. Dr. Crowfeather pulled aside a rug near the fireplace, revealing a trapdoor that opened onto stairs carved into living rock. "Bring Marcus. I'll guide everyone else." Getting an unconscious man down steep stone steps while creatures tried to break into the cabin above us was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. But we managed it, with Anika and Carmen supporting Marcus's weight while James and I carried his legs. Dr. Crowfeather brought up the rear, pausing only to activate what looked like an explosive charge that would collapse the cellar entrance after we passed. The cave system beyond the cellar was larger than I'd expected, with passages that had clearly been modified over the years to make them navigable. Emergency supplies were cached at regular intervals, and luminescent fungi provided enough natural light to see our way. "How far does this extend?" I asked as we made our way through passages that seemed to spiral deeper into the mountain. "About 3 miles, Dr. Crowfeather replied. "It comes out near the ranger station access road. The family uses these caves during the winter months when the surface becomes too dangerous." Behind us, the sound of the explosion echoed through the stone corridors. But it was followed by something worse, the sound of digging, of claws scraping against rock. The hunger was following us into the caves. We picked up our pace, taking turns carrying Marcus and helping each other navigate the increasingly treacherous passages. My radio started picking up signals as we got closer to the surface. Fragments of emergency broadcasts that told me the outside world had finally noticed our disappearance. "This is Station 7 to any rescue units in the Kiana area. We have multiple missing persons and need immediate support. Medical helicopters are standing by at the staging area. Estimated time to deployment. Weather window is closing fast. If we don't move in the next 2 hours..." The familiar voices of my colleagues brought tears to my eyes. We were almost home. The cave exit was concealed behind a waterfall that fed into the creek system near the ranger station. As we emerged into the pre-dawn light, I could see helicopters circling in the distance and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles on the access road. But our relief was short-lived. The sounds of pursuit from the caves told us that the hunger was still coming, And now we were leading it directly toward the rescue operation. "I need to warn them," I said, checking my radio. "They have no idea what they're dealing with." But Dr. Crowfeather caught my arm. "Look," he said, pointing back toward the forest we'd escaped. The family had emerged from hidden positions around the cave entrance. All of them, adults, juveniles, even some I hadn't seen before. They formed a line between us and the cave mouth, facing inward toward the darkness we'd just escaped. They were making their final stand, protecting not just us but the human world beyond the forest. The patriarch caught my eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect between two guardians who understood their responsibilities. Then he turned back to face the cave entrance as the first of the hunger creatures emerged into the morning light. What followed was a battle that no human should ever witness. The family fought with coordination and intelligence that spoke to thousands of years of evolution and cooperation. But the hunger fought with something else. A malevolent intelligence that seemed to know exactly how to cause maximum psychological as well as physical damage. "We have to go," Dr. Crowfeather said urgently. "They're buying us time, but it won't last long." The rescue helicopters had spotted us now, and one was coming in for a landing in a nearby clearing. As we helped Marcus toward the aircraft, I took one last look back at the battle raging near the cave entrance. The patriarch was down, dark blood matting his fur. But he was still fighting, still protecting the escape route. Around him, his family was being systematically torn apart by creatures that seemed to exist purely to cause suffering. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my career. "Get everyone to the helicopter," I told Dr. Crowfeather. "I'm going back." "You can't help them," he protested. "You'll just be throwing your life away." But I was already moving, drawing my service weapon even though I knew it would be useless against what I was facing. Because sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about whether you can win. Sometimes it's about standing with those who are willing to sacrifice everything to protect others. The battle was nearly over by the time I reached the cave entrance. Most of the family lay motionless, their bodies testament to their courage and loyalty. The patriarch was still alive but barely, propped against a boulder with wounds that would have killed any normal creature. The surviving hunger creatures turned toward me as I approached. Their alien features twisted in what might have been amusement. They'd decimated an entire family group of apex predators, and now a single human was challenging them. I raised my weapon, knowing it was useless but needing to make the gesture anyway. The largest of the creatures stepped forward, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of teeth designed for tearing rather than chewing. That's when the real cavalry arrived. The sound of approaching rotor blades filled the air as 3 military helicopters crested the tree line. But these weren't rescue aircraft. They were gunships, armed with weapons designed for much larger threats than human criminals. Dr. Crowfeather's radio calls had reached someone who understood the true nature of what was happening in Kiana Forest. The lead gunship opened fire with a chain gun that turned the largest hunger creature into a spray of dark fluid and twisted flesh. The remaining creatures scattered, moving with inhuman speed back into the cave system where the aircraft couldn't follow. As medics loaded the survivors into rescue helicopters, I knelt beside the patriarch of the family. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were still alert, still intelligent. With tremendous effort, he lifted one massive hand and placed it gently on my shoulder. In that moment, I understood something that would change my perspective on the natural world forever. These creatures weren't just animals fighting for territory. They were guardians, protectors of something far more important than their own lives, and they'd recognized the same dedication in me. The patriarch's eyes closed for the final time as the helicopter lifted off, carrying us away from Kiana Forest. But his sacrifice, and that of his family, had saved not just our small group of hikers, but potentially countless others who would never know how close danger had come to their world. 6 months later, I submitted my final report on the incident. The official version mentioned equipment failures, severe weather, and difficult terrain that complicated the rescue operation. There was no mention of the family, the hunger, or Dr. Crowfeather's hidden cabin, but in the classified addendum that only 3 people were authorized to read, I told the truth. Every impossible, unbelievable detail of what really happened in those mountains. Because someday, something like the hunger might return. And when it does, the people responsible for protecting the public need to know what they're really facing. The Kiana National Forest remains open to the public, though certain areas are now permanently restricted. New protocols are in place for tracking unusual animal activity, and ranger patrols carry equipment that the public doesn't need to know about. Dr. Crowfeather disappeared sometime after giving his statement to the classified investigation team. His cabin was found empty with no signs of violence or struggle. Some say he went deeper into the mountains to find surviving members of the family. Others believe he found another group that needed a guardian. I like to think he's still out there somewhere, watching over secrets that the modern world isn't ready to understand. Because in a forest full of impossible things, someone needs to stand between the monsters and the people who have no idea they exist. And sometimes, the monsters are the ones we should be grateful for. My name is Ronan Drake, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in the summer of 2002. I've learned from reading horror stories online that the most terrifying experiences are the ones that feel completely real, and this one was all too real. I was 23 then, drifting through life without much direction. College had left me with a degree in communications that nobody seemed to want, and I'd been bouncing between dead-end jobs in my hometown outside Pittsburgh. When my buddy Garrett called me up that May with a proposition, I was ready for anything that would get me out of my parents' basement. Camp counselor work, he said, his voice crackling through my ancient flip phone. Up in the Adirondacks. I did it last summer. Easy money, great scenery, and the camp director is pretty laid back. Plus, we'd get to hang out all summer. Garrett had always been the adventurous one in our group. Where I tended to overthink everything, he jumped headfirst into whatever caught his fancy. He'd convinced our friends Jason and Milo to sign up too, and before I knew it, I was packing my duffel bag for a summer in the woods. The drive north took us through increasingly remote terrain. Cell phone towers became sparse, then non-existent. The highway gave way to winding state roads, then to gravel roads that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. When we finally pulled into Camp Tall Pines, the sun was setting behind the towering pine trees that gave the place its name. The camp was exactly what you'd picture from summer movies. Rustic cabins arranged around a pristine lake, a mess hall with weathered wooden beams, fire pits scattered throughout the grounds. Everything looked like it had been there for decades, which, according to the camp director Margaret Holloway, was pretty much the case. Built in 1967, she told us during orientation, her weathered hands gesturing toward the lake. My father started this place and I've been running it for 23 years. We keep things simple here. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just kids learning to appreciate nature. Margaret was a sturdy woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor you'd expect from someone who'd spent decades managing kids and teenagers in the wilderness. But there was something else in her eyes when she looked out at the forest surrounding the camp, a wariness that seemed oddly out of place. Our living quarters were in a cabin designated for counselors, set apart from the camper cabins but still within easy walking distance of the main facilities. The building was old but well-maintained, with 4 small bedrooms, a common area, and a kitchenette. Garrett and I took the rooms on the lakeside, while Jason and Milo settled in on the forest side. That first night, we sat on the porch sharing a few beers that Garrett had smuggled in his bag. The lake stretched out before us, its surface perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a jumping fish. Milo, ever the city kid, kept swatting at mosquitoes and complaining about the sounds of the woods. "It's too damn quiet out here," he said, slapping at his neck. "How do you sleep with all this nature?" Jace laughed. "Better than sleeping next to a construction site like you do back home." "At least construction sites make sense," Milo muttered. "You know what's making the noise. Out here, every sound could be anything." I found myself agreeing with Milo more than I cared to admit. The forest at night was alive with sounds I couldn't identify, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant calls from animals I'd never heard before. Growing up in suburbia hadn't prepared me for the constant background symphony of the wilderness. "You'll get used to it," Garrett said confidently. "I barely noticed it after the first week last summer." "What about that hermit story you mentioned on the drive up?" Jace asked. "You said there were some local legends about these woods." Garrett's expression shifted slightly and he took a long sip of his beer before answering. "Oh, that. Yeah, Margaret mentioned it last year, but it's probably just camp folklore. You know how these places always have their ghost stories." He seemed reluctant to elaborate, which only made the rest of us more curious. After some prodding, he finally gave us the basics. Supposedly, there was a man living somewhere in the forest around the camp, a hermit who'd been out there for years, maybe decades. Some said he was harmless, just a recluse who wanted to be left alone. Others claimed he was dangerous, a drifter with a history of violence. "The local cops know about him," Garrett said. "They've had reports over the years, but the forest is huge. If someone wants to stay hidden out there, they can probably manage it." "Great," Milo said. "So we're sleeping in the woods with some psycho mountain man potentially watching us." "He's probably just a myth," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Every summer camp has stories like that. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself glancing toward the tree line more often than usual. The forest was thick enough that you couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet into it, even during the day. At night, it was an impenetrable wall of shadows. Our first week at camp passed uneventfully. The kids, mostly middle schoolers from various parts of upstate New York, arrived on Sunday, and we fell into the familiar rhythm of camp life. I was assigned to help with water activities, which suited me fine since I'd been a decent swimmer in high school. Garrett handled outdoor adventure programs, Jace worked with arts and crafts, and Milo reluctantly took on kitchen duty. The work was easier than I'd expected. The kids were generally well behaved, and there were enough activities to keep them busy throughout the day. Margaret ran a tight ship but wasn't unreasonable, and the other counselors were friendly enough. If not for the isolated location and that nagging sense of being watched, it would have been an ideal summer job. That feeling of being observed started during our second week. At first I attributed it to paranoia sparked by Garrett's hermit story. But as the days passed, I became increasingly certain that something was off. It wasn't anything I could point to specifically, just a persistent sense that eyes were on me when I was alone. The feeling was strongest at night. During the day, surrounded by campers and fellow counselors, I could mostly ignore it. But when darkness fell and the camp settled into sleep, that awareness of being watched became almost overwhelming. I'd lie in my narrow bed, listening to Garrett's steady breathing from the next room, and fight the urge to get up and check the windows. On Thursday of our second week, I decided to take a walk around the camp perimeter before bed. I told myself it was just to tire myself out, but really I wanted to see if I could spot anything unusual. The night was clear and warm, with enough moonlight to see the main paths without a flashlight. I made it about halfway around the camp when I heard it. A soft rustling in the woods to my left. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to listen. For a moment there was only the usual background noise of the forest. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The sound of someone or something moving through the underbrush. My heart rate spiked as I peered into the darkness between the trees. The moonlight didn't penetrate far into the forest, and I couldn't make out anything beyond the first few feet. But I was certain something was there, just beyond the edge of visibility. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The rustling stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for some response or sign of movement. Nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to continue walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder or listen for sounds behind me. When I finally made it back to the counselor cabin, I was sweating despite the cool night air. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about the sounds in the forest and that suffocating sense of being watched. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures moving through the trees, always just out of sight but somehow getting closer. The next morning, I considered mentioning the incident to the others but decided against it. What would I tell them? That I'd heard some rustling in the woods? That I felt like someone was watching me? It sounded paranoid even to me, but as I went about my duties that day, supervising kids at the lake and helping with afternoon activities, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. Something was out there in the forest surrounding Camp Tall Pines, something that knew we were here, and somehow I was certain it was waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The weekend brought a brief respite from the oppressive feeling of being watched. Parents arrived Saturday morning to pick up the first group of campers, and the bustle of activity seemed to drive away whatever shadows had been haunting my thoughts. For a few hours, surrounded by families and normal conversations about homework and soccer practice, Camp Tall Pines felt like just another summer camp. But Sunday evening brought a new group of kids, and with them the return of that familiar unease. As the parents drove away down the gravel road, leaving their children in our care for another 2 weeks, I felt the weight of isolation settling back over the camp like a thick blanket. Margaret called a staff meeting that night after the campers were settled in their cabins. The 8 counselors gathered in the mess hall, nursing cups of coffee and comparing notes about the new arrivals. Most of the conversation was routine, which kids might be homesick, dietary restrictions, the usual behavioral issues that cropped up in any group of 12 and 13-year-olds. "One more thing," Margaret said as the meeting was winding down. "I want to remind everyone about safety protocols, especially during evening activities." She paused, her weathered fingers drumming against the wooden table. In the lamplight, the lines around her eyes seemed deeper than usual. "I know some of you have heard stories about these woods," she continued, her gaze moving from face to face. "Local legends, camp folklore, that sort of thing. I want to be clear, we take safety seriously here, but we don't let superstition interfere with our programs. Garrett shifted in his seat beside me. Are you talking about the hermit story? Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Among other things. Look, I've been running this camp for over 2 decades. In that time, we've had exactly 3 incidents that could be considered unusual. She held up 3 fingers. Summer of 1987, we had some supplies go missing from the storage shed. Summer of 1994, one of the counselors reported seeing someone watching the camp from the tree line. And last summer, we found what looked like a temporary shelter about half a mile into the woods. Just some branches and a tarp, nothing elaborate. Did you call the police? Asked Sarah, one of the senior counselors. Each time, Margaret nodded. They investigated, found no evidence of any immediate threat. Their official position is that we occasionally get transients passing through the area. People who prefer to avoid contact with others. But you don't think that's all it is, I said. It wasn't really a question. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. I think these woods have been home to all kinds of people over the years. Some who chose to live off the grid, others who maybe didn't have a choice. As long as they keep their distance and don't interfere with camp operations, it's not really our concern. After the meeting, Garrett and I walked back to our cabin in silence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the night darker than usual. Our flashlight beam carved a narrow cone of visibility ahead of us, leaving everything else shrouded in impenetrable black. She knows more than she's saying, I finally said once we were safely inside. Probably, Garrett agreed, settling into one of the mismatched armchairs in our common area. But think about it from her perspective. This camp is her livelihood. She can't afford to have parents think their kids aren't safe. Are they safe, though? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Last summer was my first time here. I never saw anything unusual, never felt threatened. But there were a couple of nights when I could have sworn someone was out there, watching. It's probably nothing, just the isolation getting to me. But I definitely felt it. Milo emerged from his room, overhearing the tail end of our conversation. Felt what? We filled him and Jace in on Margaret's comments about the incidents over the years. Milo's face grew increasingly pale as we talked. So let me get this straight, he said. There's potentially some deranged hermit living in the woods around here. The camp director knows about it, and we're supposed to just pretend everything's normal. It's probably not as dramatic as all that, Jace said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Lots of people live off the grid. Doesn't make them dangerous. Right, Milo said sarcastically. I'm sure the guy hiding in the woods watching kids at summer camp is completely harmless. I found myself siding with Milo's pessimism. Something about Margaret's careful non-answers bothered me. If the situation was as benign as she wanted us to believe, why bring it up at all? Why the warnings about safety protocols? The next few days passed without incident, but the conversation had planted seeds of doubt in all our minds. We found ourselves paying closer attention to our surroundings, lingering near other counselors rather than wandering off alone. The easy camaraderie of our first weeks was replaced by a subtle but persistent tension. On Wednesday evening, I was helping clean up after the campfire when 10-year-old Emma Kowalski tugged on my sleeve. Mr. Ronan, she whispered, glancing around to make sure the other kids weren't listening. Can I tell you something? I crouched down to her level. Emma was one of the quieter kids in camp, thoughtful and observant in a way that sometimes seemed beyond her years. Of course. What's on your mind? Last night, when I got up to use the bathroom, I looked out the window. She paused, biting her lower lip. There was a man standing by the trees, just standing there, looking at our cabin. My stomach dropped. Are you sure? It was pretty dark last night. I'm sure. He was really tall and skinny, and he wasn't wearing much clothes. Just standing there for a long time, not moving. Did you tell any of the other counselors? Emma shook her head. I thought they might not believe me. Kids always think they see things at camp, right? But I know what I saw. I assured Emma that she'd done the right thing by telling me, and promised to look into it. But as I walked her back to her cabin, my mind was racing. A tall, thin man watching the children's cabins at night. That was exactly the kind of detail that Margaret's careful warnings hadn't prepared us for. After the kids were settled for the night, I found Garrett and told him about Emma's report. His face went grim as I described the figure she'd seen. We need to tell Margaret, he said. Do we? She's made it pretty clear she doesn't want us getting spooked by local legends. This isn't a legend, Ronan. This is a kid reporting that someone was watching her cabin in the middle of the night. He was right, of course. Whatever Margaret's feelings about camp folklore, The safety of the children had to come first. We found her in her office, working on the next day's activity schedules by lamplight. Her reaction to Emma's report was harder to read than I'd expected. She listened without interruption, asked a few clarifying questions, then sat back in her chair with a heavy sigh. "I'll talk to Emma tomorrow," she said finally. "And I'll have Sarah do a perimeter check before lights out for the rest of the week." "That's it?" I asked. "Shouldn't we call the sheriff and tell them what? That a 10-year-old thought she saw someone in the woods? They'll ask if we have any evidence, any proof that an actual person was on the property. When I say no, they'll file a report and forget about it." Margaret stood up and moved to the window, peering out at the dark forest beyond. "Look, I'm not dismissing Emma's report, but I've learned that jumping to conclusions about every shadow or strange sound just creates panic. If there really is someone out there, getting everyone worked up isn't going to help the situation." I wanted to argue, but something in her tone suggested the conversation was over. Garrett and I left her office feeling more unsettled than before. Margaret's calm reaction almost seemed rehearsed, as if she'd been expecting something like this to happen. That night, I volunteered to take the late-night security walk around the camp. It was an unofficial duty that the counselors rotated, just a quick check to make sure all the buildings were secure and the kids were asleep. Usually it took 15 or 20 minutes, and served more to ease our own minds than address any real security concerns. But as I made my rounds that night, flashlight in hand, I found myself moving more slowly and checking more carefully than usual. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every night sound potentially threatening. When I reached the area near Emma's cabin, I spent several minutes examining the tree line where she'd reported seeing the figure. The ground was too hard and covered with pine needles to show clear footprints, but something about the spot felt wrong. Not anything I could point to specifically, just an intuitive sense that someone had been standing there recently, watching, waiting. I was about to continue my rounds when I heard it. The soft snap of a branch somewhere in the woods behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees, but saw nothing except shadows and pine trunks. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The forest was silent except for the usual background chorus of insects and small animals. But I could feel it again, that overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Someone was out there in the darkness, close enough to hear my voice, close enough to see the beam of my flashlight, close enough to reach me if they wanted to. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound of movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. Finally, my nerve broke and I hurried back toward the main camp, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I reached the safety of the counselor cabin, I was breathing hard and my hands were shaking. Whatever was out there in the woods around Camp Tall Pines, it was getting bolder. And I was beginning to suspect that Margaret knew exactly what we were dealing with. The question was, why wasn't she telling us the truth? The incident near Emma's cabin marked a turning point in our summer at Camp Tall Pines. What had been vague unease and half-glimpsed shadows was crystallizing into something more concrete and far more threatening. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Margaret carefully, looking for clues about what she might be hiding from us. She spoke privately with Emma, just as she'd promised, but when I asked about it later, she was frustratingly vague. "Kids see things differently than adults," was all she'd say. Sometimes their imaginations fill in details that weren't really there. But Emma wasn't the type of kid to make things up, and her description had been too specific and consistent to dismiss as imagination. I started paying closer attention to the other campers, listening for any similar reports or unusual behavior. It didn't take long to find them. Marcus, a 12-year-old from Albany, mentioned offhandedly that he'd heard someone walking around outside his cabin the night before. When I pressed for details, he described the sound of footsteps in the gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the building multiple times. 10-year-old Sophia reported seeing a face at the window of the Arts and Crafts building during lunch. "It was there for just a second," she said, "but he had really long hair and he looked hungry." Each incident on its own could be explained away. Active imaginations, shadows playing tricks, the natural anxiety that came with being away from home. But taken together, they painted a picture that was increasingly hard to ignore. Someone was watching the camp, getting closer to the buildings, becoming bolder about showing himself. By Thursday evening, the tension among the counselors was palpable. Even Margaret seemed more on edge than usual, though she continued to downplay our concerns. When Garrett suggested implementing buddy system protocols for both campers and staff, she reluctantly agreed. "Just as a precaution," she said. "I don't want anyone getting the wrong idea about why we're doing this." That night was scheduled for one of the camp's most popular activities, a night swim in the lake, followed by a campfire and s'mores. The weather was perfect for it, warm and clear with a gentle breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a magical evening for the kids. But as we prepared for the activity, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making ourselves vulnerable. The lake was isolated, surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. The nearest building was the boathouse, a good 50 yards from the swimming area. If something happened, if someone wanted to approach the camp undetected, the night swim would provide the perfect opportunity. I voiced my concerns to Garrett as we supervised the kids changing into their swimsuits. Maybe we should postpone this, I said. At least until we figure out what's going on. And tell the kids what? That we're canceling their favorite activity because we're spooked by some ghost stories? He had a point. The children had been looking forward to the night swim all week. Canceling it without a clear and immediate threat would only create panic and ruin their camp experience. But as we led the group down to the lake, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and while there was still some ambient light from the rising moon, the forest had become an impenetrable wall of shadows. Anyone could be watching from those trees, and we'd never know until it was too late. The kids splashed into the water with their usual enthusiasm, their laughter echoing across the lake. Sarah and 2 other counselors stayed on the shore to supervise, while Garrett, Jace, and I waded in to keep an eye on the swimmers. For a while, everything seemed normal, just kids being kids, enjoying the freedom of swimming under the stars. That's when Milo, who had stayed on shore to tend the campfire, called out to us. "Hey guys, you might want to see this." There was something in his tone that made all of us look up immediately. He was standing at the edge of the fire pit, pointing toward the far side of the lake. "There's a light over there," he said. "In the trees across the water." I squinted in the direction he was pointing and saw it, a faint, yellowish glow moving slowly through the forest. It was too steady to be a flashlight, too bright to be a reflection. As we watched, it stopped moving and seemed to hover about 6 feet off the ground. "Probably just someone camping," Sarah said, but her voice carried no conviction. "This is all private property," Garrett replied. "No camping allowed." The light began moving again, tracking along the shoreline in our direction. The kids in the water had noticed it too and were gathering closer to us, their excited chatter taking on a nervous edge. "Okay, everyone out of the water," I announced, trying to keep my voice calm. "Time for campfire stories." The children grumbled but complied, swimming toward shore with only a few backward glances at the mysterious light. As they climbed out and wrapped themselves in towels, I kept one eye on the forest across the lake. The light had stopped again, and although the distance made it impossible to be certain, I had the unsettling feeling that whoever was holding it was looking directly at us. We gathered around the campfire, but the usual magic of the evening was gone. The kids were distracted, constantly glancing toward the lake and asking questions about the light. Margaret had joined us by then, and I could see the tension in her posture as she helped distribute marshmallows and graham crackers. "Margaret," I said quietly, pulling her aside, "we need to get the kids back to their cabins." She nodded. But before she could respond, one of the younger campers screamed. The light across the lake had moved much closer, impossibly closer. It was now at the water's edge directly across from us, no more than 100 yards away. In the glow, we could make out the silhouette of a figure standing motionless among the cattails. "Everyone stay calm," Margaret said loudly, but her voice was tight with controlled fear. "Counselors, please escort your groups back to the cabins." Quietly and quickly, the kids didn't need to be told twice. Whatever they were seeing in that distant light had triggered some primal alarm, and they clustered around us as we led them away from the lake. I brought up the rear of our group, constantly glancing back to check on the light. It followed us. As we moved up the path toward the main camp, the light began tracking along the shoreline, maintaining its distance but clearly keeping pace with our group. When we reached the cabins and started getting the kids settled for the night, I could still see it through the trees. A steady, unblinking eye watching from the darkness. "What was that?" Emma whispered as I tucked her into her bunk. "Who was that man by the lake?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I admitted. "But you're safe here. All the counselors are going to be keeping watch tonight." It wasn't much comfort, but it was all I could offer. The truth was, I had no idea what we were dealing with or how to protect the children from it. After the campers were settled, the counselors gathered in the mess hall for an emergency meeting. Margaret looked older than I'd ever seen her, the weight of responsibility and whatever secrets she'd been keeping clearly taking their toll. "I think it's time you told us what's really going on," Garrett said without preamble. "That wasn't some random transient passing through. Someone is actively watching this camp and they're getting bolder about it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name is Luther Vance," she said. "At least, that's what the police files say. He's been living in these woods for almost 15 years. She went on to explain what she knew about Vance, a former medical professional who'd suffered some kind of breakdown after losing his family in a car accident. He'd disappeared from his practice in Syracuse in 1987 and hadn't been seen in civilized society since. "The police know about him," Margaret continued. "They've tried to apprehend him several times over the years, but he knows these woods better than anyone. He's resourceful, and he's never actually committed a crime that they can prove." "What about trespassing?" Sarah demanded. "Stalking, threatening the safety of children?" "No direct threats," Margaret said. "No evidence that he's ever harmed anyone. The police classify him as a missing person, not a criminal. Their official position is that he has a right to live how he chooses, as long as he's not breaking any laws." "But you think he's dangerous," I said. Margaret's eyes met mine, and in them I saw fear that she'd been hiding for years. "I think he's broken," she said finally. "Mentally, emotionally, maybe physically. And I think his interest in this camp is unhealthy. But I also think that as long as we don't provoke him, as long as we keep our distance, he'll continue to keep his." "And if we don't?" Jace asked. Margaret didn't answer, but the silence that followed was more frightening than any words could have been. Outside, the light had finally disappeared from the lake shore. But somehow, I knew that Luther Vance hadn't gone far. He was still out there in the darkness, watching and waiting for something. I just hoped we wouldn't find out what that something was. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I lay in my narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to Garrett's restless breathing from the next room. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and padded quietly to the window. The camp was bathed in pale moonlight, peaceful and still except for the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those shadows, Luther Vance was watching, waiting, planning whatever came next in his twisted relationship with Camp Tall Pines. Morning brought a false sense of normalcy. The kids were their usual energetic selves at breakfast, any lingering fear from the previous night forgotten in the excitement of a new day's activities. Margaret had clearly spoken to the other counselors because everyone was making an extra effort to maintain the regular schedule and keep things light. But beneath the surface, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. We all felt it, the sense that something fundamental had shifted the night before. The threat was no longer theoretical or distant. Luther Vance had made his presence known, had demonstrated his ability to get close to the camp whenever he chose. The only question now was what he intended to do with that access. I was supervising the morning swim when I noticed the first new sign of his presence. A section of the rope that marked the swimming area's boundary had been cut, not frayed or worn, but sliced cleanly through with something sharp. The rope floated loose in the water, one end disappearing into the murky depths near the dock. "Probably just wear and tear," Sarah suggested when I pointed it out. But her voice lacked conviction. We both knew the rope had been intact the day before. More unsettling discoveries followed throughout the day. The camp's tool shed had been broken into, though nothing seemed to be missing. Strange marks appeared on several trees around the perimeter. Not random scratches, but deliberate cuts that formed crude symbols I didn't recognize. And most disturbing of all, someone had been in the kitchen during the night. Milo discovered that one when he arrived for breakfast prep at 6 a.m. Nothing had been stolen, but items had been moved, rearranged in ways that spoke of careful examination rather than random searching. The knives were laid out on the counter in a precise line, largest to smallest. The pantry shelves had been reorganized with almost obsessive attention to detail. "It's like he was cataloging everything," Milo said, his voice shaky as he described the scene. "Like he was making an inventory of our supplies." The psychological effect of these intrusions was immediate and devastating. The counselors moved in groups, constantly looking over their shoulders. The kids sensed our anxiety despite our efforts to hide it, becoming clingy and reluctant to participate in activities that took them far from the main buildings. By afternoon, Margaret made the decision I'd been hoping for since the previous evening. "I'm calling the sheriff," she announced during an impromptu staff meeting. "Whatever Luther's intentions, this level of intrusion is unacceptable." Sheriff David Kowalski, Emma's father as it turned out, arrived within an hour. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. But when Margaret explained the situation, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Luther Vance," he said, shaking his head. "I was hoping we'd seen the last of him." "You know him?" Garrett asked. "Oh, I know him. Been trying to bring him in for questioning half a dozen times over the years. The man's like smoke. There one minute, gone the next. And he knows these woods better than the animals that live in them." Sheriff Kowalski spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the evidence of Luther's presence and interviewing the children who'd reported seeing him. When he was finished, he gathered all the adults for a candid conversation about our options. "Here's the situation," he said bluntly. "Legally, I can't do much until Vance actually commits a crime or directly threatens someone. Trespassing charges won't stick. He's too careful to leave clear evidence, and these woods cover thousands of acres. Half the boundaries aren't even properly marked." "What about the break-ins?" I asked. "The kitchen, the tool shed, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. A good lawyer could argue that doors were left unlocked, that the disturbances were caused by animals or camp staff. Unless we catch him in the act, it's all circumstantial." Margaret's face was pale. "So what do you recommend?" The sheriff was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Pack up the kids and send them home. Close the camp early. Wait for Luther to move on, or for us to get lucky and find his camp." "I can't do that," Margaret said immediately. "This place is my livelihood, and most of these families have already paid for the full session. Then we need to take precautions. Lock everything down at night. Maintain constant supervision of the children, and hope that Luther's interest in this place doesn't escalate beyond watching." That evening, the camp felt like a fortress under siege. Extra locks were installed on all the buildings. The counselors organized themselves into a rotating patrol schedule to maintain surveillance throughout the night. And for the first time since I'd arrived at Camp Tall Pines, we gathered all the children in the main hall for the evening instead of their individual cabins. The kids sensed that something serious was happening, despite our attempts to frame the new security measures as a fun camp-wide sleepover. They huddled together in their sleeping bags, whispering nervously and jumping at every unexpected sound. Around 11 p.m., as the children were finally settling down to sleep, I stepped outside for some air. The night was warm and humid, with thick clouds obscuring most of the stars. Perfect weather for someone who wanted to move unseen through the forest. I was checking the locks on the equipment shed when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Whistling. A slow, tuneless melody drifting through the trees from somewhere beyond the main camp. It was too distant to pinpoint the source, but loud enough to be clearly deliberate. Luther Vance was announcing his presence, letting us know he was out there in the darkness. The psychological warfare had begun in earnest. I hurried back to the main hall and found Margaret standing guard by the door, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. "You heard it too," she said. "It wasn't a question." I nodded. "How long has he been doing this? The whistling?" "It started last summer," she admitted. "Just occasional at first, then more frequent as the season went on. Always at night, always from different locations. Like he was mapping the camp, learning our routines." "And you didn't think to mention this before?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "What good would it have done? You'd have spent the whole summer jumping at shadows instead of just the last few weeks." The whistling continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes close enough to make the children stir in their sleep, sometimes so distant it was barely audible. Each time it started, Margaret and I would exchange glances, counting the seconds until it stopped, wondering what message Luther was trying to send. By morning, we were all exhausted and on edge. The false cheer we'd maintained for the children's sake was wearing thin, and even the kids were asking direct questions about why we'd all slept in the same room. That's when Sheriff Kowalski returned with news that changed everything. "We found his camp," he announced without preamble. "About 2 miles northeast of here, in a ravine that's almost impossible to spot from above. He's been living there for years, lean-to shelter, food caches, even a workshop of sorts." "Did you arrest him?" Margaret asked hopefully. The sheriff shook his head. "He wasn't there, but we found evidence that he abandoned the site recently, packed up everything portable and moved on." "That's good news, right?" Jace said. "If he's gone, he's not gone," the sheriff interrupted. "He's just changed locations, and based on what we found at his old camp, I think his interest in this place has become an obsession." He pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase and emptied its contents onto the table. Photographs, dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens from the forest surrounding the camp. Pictures of children swimming in the lake, counselors leading activities, staff members going about their daily routines, and in the center of the pile, A detailed hand-drawn map of the entire camp, complete with building layouts, walking paths, and what looked like guard schedules. "He's been studying you," Sheriff Kowalski said grimly. "Learning your patterns, your vulnerabilities. This isn't random harassment anymore. Luther Vance is planning something specific." "What do we do?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The sheriff met my eyes, and in his expression I saw the same fear that had been growing in all of us for days. "We evacuate the camp," he said, "tonight, before he decides to make his move." But as we began making preparations for the emergency evacuation, none of us realized that Luther Vance was already several steps ahead of us. And by the time we discovered just how close he'd gotten to the children we were supposed to protect, it would be almost too late. The evacuation should have been straightforward. Parents called, buses arranged, children packed and ready to leave by the following morning. But Luther Vance had been watching us too long, learning our routines too well, to let us simply walk away from his carefully constructed obsession. It started with the phone lines. Margaret discovered the problem when she tried to call the first group of parents that evening. The landline in her office was dead. Not just no dial tone, but completely silent. The main camp phone in the kitchen suffered the same fate. Someone had cut the lines, probably during the day while we were all focused on the children's activities. "Cell service has never worked out here," Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The nearest working phone is at the gas station 12 miles down the mountain road." Sheriff Kowalski's radio crackled with static when he tried to call for backup. The mountains played havoc with radio signals under the best of circumstances, and the thick cloud cover that had been building all day made communication nearly impossible. "I'll drive to town," he said. "Get reinforcements and contact the parents from there. You keep everyone together until I get back." He left just as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time his taillights disappeared around the bend in the access road, the storm had become a steady downpour that drummed against the roof of the main hall and turned the camp's dirt paths into muddy streams. We gathered all the children in the mess hall, ostensibly for an evening of indoor activities while we waited out the rain. The kids were restless and anxious, picking up on the tension radiating from every adult in the room. I did my best to organize games and keep them distracted, but my attention kept drifting to the windows and the darkness beyond. The power went out at 9:47 p.m. One moment we were surrounded by the warm glow of electric lights. The next we were plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the emergency lanterns Margaret had distributed earlier in the day. The children's nervous chatter immediately spiked into frightened whispers and barely contained sobs. "Generators in the maintenance shed," Margaret said quietly. But in this storm, she didn't need to finish the thought. None of us wanted to venture outside in the dark and rain to check on the generator. Not with Luther Vance somewhere out there in the night. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from outside, somewhere near the lake, a sound of pure terror that cut through the storm like a knife. Every adult in the room froze, and several of the younger children began to cry. "Stay with the kids," I told Garrett, grabbing one of the heavy flashlights from the supply table. "Don't let anyone leave this building." I stepped out into the storm before anyone could argue. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking me to the skin within seconds. My flashlight beam struggled to penetrate more than a few feet through the downpour, creating a tiny bubble of visibility in the overwhelming darkness. The scream came again, closer this time, and I realized with horror that it wasn't human. It was Luther Vance, imitating the sound of a child in distress. The psychological warfare had escalated into direct intimidation, and he was trying to lure us away from the safety of the main building. I was about to retreat inside when I heard a different sound, the splintering of wood, coming from the direction of the equipment shed. Someone was breaking in, and this time they weren't being subtle about it. My flashlight beam found the shed just as a figure emerged from its doorway. Luther Vance stepped into the circle of light, and I got my first clear look at the man who'd been terrorizing our camp. He was tall and gaunt, just as the children had described, with long gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His clothes were little more than rags, and his exposed skin was pale and covered with scars. But it was his eyes that truly frightened me. Wild and unfocused, with the fixed stare of someone who'd long since lost touch with reality. In his hands, he carried an axe from the equipment shed. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "This is my place. These are my woods." I took a step backward, trying to keep the flashlight trained on him while moving toward the safety of the main building. "We're leaving tomorrow," I called out. "The camp is closing. You can have your woods back." Luther laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Leaving? Oh no, that's not how this works. You've seen too much, heard too much. The children especially, they remember everything, don't they? Tell stories about the scary man in the woods. He began walking toward me, the axe swinging loosely at his side. I turned and ran for the mess hall, my feet slipping in the mud as I fought to maintain my balance. Behind me I could hear Luther's laughter echoing through the rain. I burst through the door of the main building, soaking wet and breathing hard. "He's here," I gasped. "Luther's here, and he's armed." The room erupted in controlled chaos as the counselors tried to keep the children calm while preparing for a siege. Margaret pulled out her cell phone and tried repeatedly to get a signal, moving from window to window in search of even one bar of service. "Barricade the doors," Garrett said, already pushing tables against the main entrance. "Use whatever we can find." We worked quickly and quietly, stacking furniture against every possible entry point while trying not to terrify the children more than necessary. But the kids weren't stupid. They could see the fear in our faces, could sense that this was more serious than any of the previous incidents. "Is the bad man coming to get us?" Emma whispered, clutching her stuffed animal against her chest. I wanted to lie, to tell her everything would be fine, but the words wouldn't come. Luther Vance was out there in the darkness, armed and clearly unhinged, and we were trapped in this building until Sheriff Kowalski returned with help. The first assault on our defenses came 20 minutes later. Luther appeared at one of the side windows, his face pressed against the glass as he peered into the lantern-lit interior. Several children screamed when they saw him, and he responded by raising the axe and bringing it down against the window frame. The glass held, but spiderweb cracks spread across its surface. He struck it again, and again, each blow sending the children deeper into hysteria. "Get away from the windows!" Margaret shouted, herding the kids toward the center of the room. Luther's laughter filtered through the damaged glass as he moved to the next window and repeated the process. He was systematically testing our defenses, looking for the weakest point in our barricade. That's when I realized the flaw in our plan. The mess hall had large windows on 3 sides and only one exit, the door we'd barricaded. We'd trapped ourselves in a building that Luther could easily break into, with no way to escape if he got inside. "We need to move," I told Garrett urgently. "This building is a death trap." "Move where?" "It's pouring rain, and he's got an axe." "The kitchen," I said, remembering the layout of the camp buildings. "It's got a rear exit that leads to the storage building. From there we can reach the vehicles." Margaret overheard and shook her head. "The keys to the camp vehicles are in my office, and my office is in the administration building. We'd have to cross open ground to reach it." Before anyone could respond, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the room. Luther had found a window with a weaker frame and was methodically chopping his way through it. We had maybe minutes before he broke through. "I'll go for the keys," I said. "The rest of you get the kids to the kitchen and wait for my signal." "That's suicide," Garrett protested. "You'll never make it across the camp in this darkness. I've got a better chance alone than all of us do trying to move 30 kids through the storm." There was no time to argue. Luther's axe broke through the window frame with a crash that sent wood splinters flying across the room. His arms snaked through the opening, feeling for the window latch. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy poker from the fireplace, then slipped out the kitchen's rear door into the storm. The rain was still coming down in torrents, and lightning was beginning to flash in the distance. Perfect cover for what I was about to attempt. The administration building was 100 yards away across an open area that offered no concealment. I sprinted across the muddy ground, expecting at any moment to hear Luther's voice behind me or feel the bite of his axe between my shoulder blades. I reached Margaret's office without incident and found the vehicle keys hanging on a hook behind her desk. But as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps on the wooden steps outside. Slow, deliberate, and definitely not friendly. Luther had anticipated my move. I clicked off my flashlight and crouched behind the desk as his shadow passed by the window. He was checking the building methodically, testing doors and windows just as he'd done at the mess hall. When he reached the office door, he stopped. "I know you're in there," he said conversationally. "Came for the keys, didn't you? Smart boy. But not smart enough." The door handle turned slowly. I gripped the fire poker tighter and prepared to fight for my life. Luther stepped into the room, and in the brief flash of lightning that followed, I saw that his eyes had found mine in the darkness. His smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Time to end this game," he whispered, raising the axe above his head. I lunged forward with the poker, aiming for his midsection. The blow connected, driving him backward into the doorframe. He stumbled but didn't fall, bringing the axe down in a vicious arc that missed my head by inches. We grappled in the darkness, Luther's superior size and reach balanced against my desperation and the confined space that limited his ability to swing the axe effectively. I managed to get in several more blows with the poker before he grabbed my wrist and twisted until I dropped it, but the fight had bought me enough time to grab the keys and dodge past him toward the door. I sprinted back across the camp toward the kitchen, Luther's enraged roars echoing behind me through the storm. I found the others huddled in the kitchen, the children silent with terror while the counselors kept watch at the windows. "Got them," I gasped, holding up the keys. "But he's right behind me." We moved quickly toward the vehicles, a ragged line of frightened children and exhausted adults stumbling through the mud and rain. The camp bus was parked near the maintenance building, and I'd never been so happy to see a vehicle in my life. But as I inserted the key into the ignition, Luther Vance stepped into the headlight beams directly in front of the bus. His clothes were torn from our fight, and blood streamed from a cut on his forehead. The axe hung loosely in his right hand. "End of the line," he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Nobody leaves until we settle this." Through the bus's windshield, I could see his eyes, no longer wild and unfocused, but cold and calculating. Whatever madness had consumed him over the years, it had crystallized into a single deadly purpose. But as I sat there staring at this broken man who'd terrorized us for weeks, I realized something important. Luther Vance was just human. Disturbed, dangerous, but ultimately just a man who'd spent too many years alone in the woods with his grief and guilt. And humans could be stopped. I gunned the engine and hit the gas. Luther's eyes widened as he realized I wasn't going to stop or negotiate. He dove to the side as the bus roared forward, and I heard the axe clatter against the vehicle's metal side. We didn't stop driving until we reached the sheriff's station in town, where Sheriff Kowalski was waiting with backup and very worried parents. Luther Vance was arrested 3 days later, found wandering the highway in a state of complete mental collapse. The investigation revealed the full extent of his obsession with Camp Tall Pines. He'd been watching the place for over a decade, documenting every activity, every staff change, every group of children who came and went. In his fractured mind, the camp had become both a reminder of the family he'd lost and a target for the rage that loss had created. Camp Tall Pines never reopened. Margaret sold the property to the state, which turned it into a wildlife preserve. Sometimes I wonder if Luther's spirit still wanders those woods, forever searching for the peace that eluded him in life. As for me, I left the mountains that summer and never went back. But on quiet nights when the wind is howling through the trees, I still sometimes hear the echo of his voice calling through the darkness. And I remember that the scariest monsters aren't the ones from ghost stories or local legends. They're the broken people who've lost their way in the shadows between sanity and madness, watching from the woods while the rest of us sleep safely in our beds.